It is my pleasure to join you today from Jerusalem. The holy city has been my home since I was a boy. I now serve as the 141st Patriarch of Jerusalem. Following an unbroken line of succession, I am honored to walk in the footsteps of St. James, the brother of our Lord Jesus Christ and first leader of the Church in Jerusalem. As members of the world's oldest Christian community, we are first and foremost a worshiping community. Every day continue the rhythm of prayer and worship that the first Christians began 2,000 years ago. Our city may be extraordinary, but our lives are ordinary. In addition to the steady round of worship, we serve the poor and care for those in need. We share the good news of the gospel in our churches and holy sites. We run schools, health centers, and many different charities for the community at large. Listening to the voice of the Holy Bible, love thy neighbor, and pray for the peace of Jerusalem. As churches in the Holy Land, we serve both our local community and the wider world. It is our sacred duty to extend Christ's ministry of hospitality to all. In normal times, we welcome millions of visitors. People of every nationality and religious affiliation flock to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre and numerous holy sites across the Holy Land. These are, of course, not normal times. Since early this year, the Holy City has been strangely still. COVID-19 has quietened our streets and rendered our future less certain. Our communities rely a great deal on the income from visitors. A year without pilgrimage and tourism has decimated local businesses and threatens the livelihoods of families who have served pilgrims for generations. As churches, we have been deprived of our God-given ministry to share hospitality with the global community. As such, we long for the day when normality returns and the rest of the world can visit us once more. Our precarious present long precedes the pandemic. Over recent decades, we have experienced increasing challenges to the integrity and sustainability of the Christian presence in the region. We suffer at the hands of radical groups who seek our eviction even from the Christian quarter of Jerusalem itself. Our lives are marked by faith and hope. We are not despondent. We give thanks to God in all things, and we are particularly grateful for the support of people around the world who have acknowledged our plight and come to our aid. I am particularly grateful to the Aglosphere Society for joining us on this digital event today. The growing interest in our Christian community from individuals, institutions, and societies across the globe has brought great encouragement and has already resulted in positive changes here in the Holy Land. I hope we can work together to ensure that the Church of the Holy Land remain a blessing for the world. With your help, we, the Christian community of the Holy Land, can flourish and thrive. And when travel becomes possible, you are warmly invited to come and visit us here. You will enjoy the warmest of welcome and the journey of a lifetime. Thank you.
A stirring introduction from the Patriarch of Jerusalem. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Amanda Bowman. I'm the founder of the Anglosphere Society. So I'm delighted to invite you to our 5th annual Symposium on Religious Liberty. And I extend this welcome to the many people who who are with us in spirit. We are delighted to have you with us, and hopefully, as the Jewish people say about Jerusalem, we will meet again next year in person. When he was interviewed in the spring, reflecting on the impact of COVID on our everyday lives, the Holy Father said that we need to open up new horizons, open windows, open transcendence towards God and towards people. And that is what we've been trying to do in the past 9 months, opening windows and transcending the human toll of the pandemic, making sure that in T.S. Eliot's words, we don't have the experience and miss the meaning. In the past 2 years, our focus has been on religious liberty and its importance as a policy priority for the United States and the Western world. We've concentrated on the steps that need to be taken to ameliorate the suffering of persecuted minorities across the globe. In other words, what can and should be done to stem the tide of anti-Semitism, the oppression of other minorities, including the Yazidi and Uyghur population, and of course with a singular focus on Christian genocide. But maybe, as much because of the suffering of so many of the globe's population today, we decided to focus on witnesses to the faith and to the resilience and fortitude of the human spirit, often in the face of unimaginable tribulation. In taking this approach, special thanks are due to my wonderful co-chairs, Nina Shea and Stephen Raj, and perhaps most of all, Andrew Walter, who started the symposium journey with us, encouraging us and enabling its development all the way till the Lord took him to heaven on November the 1st, the Feast of All Saints. In the past couple of years, the situation for minority faith groups has only worsened. In 18 out of 38 countries, due to aggressive nationalism, violent and systematic intimidation of religious minorities has increased in countries like China and India, resulting in faith communities as being viewed as threatening the state. After the war, Winston Churchill spoke about an iron curtain descending over Europe. Now in the West, it's more like a curtain of indifference, behind which faith communities, most especially Christians, the most persecuted in the world, suffer and remain largely ignored by a religiously illiterate West. It's our hope that through programs like these, we will over time overcome this and awaken a sense of the privilege of being able to practice one's faith peacefully and reach out to help those who are suffering for theirs. We begin today's program with a discussion about the growth of religious persecution in China. As you will see from the arresting cover of The Economist, the repression of the Uyghur population is stirring the conscience of the West, but less is heard about the widespread suppression of Christianity, which will be our focus today. Our speakers include Lord Alton, a tireless advocate and legislator across the globe, Nina Shea, international human rights lawyer and director of the Centre for Religious Freedom at the Hudson Institute, and the extraordinary Chen Guangcheng, whose human rights activism led him to being imprisoned and tortured in China before his miraculous escape to the West. And then Gordon Chang, whose insights into China and its policies have made him a favourite commentator on multiple television channels, will join me in a discussion that follows. Due to COVID restrictions, these speakers, with the exception of Gordon and myself, and Gordon is a resident of the New York area, will speak via videotape. We will start with a taped interview with Lord Alton, who spoke from Westminster last week in an interview with David O'Troy Bolt. And Nina will then give us an interview on overview of the outlook for Christians in China, and then Cheng Guancheng will give a witness testimony to his experiences in China. And Gordon and I will close the discussions following these presentations. Ladies and gentlemen, let us listen to Lord Alton.
It's a great pleasure to be here in the Savile Club in London interviewing David Lord Alton of Liverpool. Lord Alton was a Liberal Member of Parliament from 1979 until 1997, since when he has sat on the crossbenches in the House of Lords. He's well known for his advocacy of persecuted religious minorities and for being one of the most prominent Catholics in the United Kingdom. David Lord Alton.
On your website, Lord Alton, you quote Tolkien, "There's some good in this world and it's worth fighting for." Would you tell our audience, what are some of the things you've fought hardest for in your life?
Well, I'm a big admirer of J.R.R. Tolkien and his friend C.S. Lewis. And when I was a boy, the librarian in our public lending library pointed me at their books, and I think it was one of the best things that anyone ever did for me. And I've followed, since then, I followed the not just the stories that they wrote about, but the ideas that they stood for and their outlook on life. And Tolkien particularly, in the way that he describes the struggle that takes place in every generation and between good and evil, and without being Manichaean about this, nevertheless, there is a struggle that takes place and people have got to do what they can. And I love the idea of the Hobbit, the person who doesn't have a great deal of power, who feels the scale of the odds against you are so stacked against you, and yet you've still got to struggle in any way you can. I love the character of Sam as well, because Sam is there as an encourager and to help out. And I think that we've got to do more to encourage one another, but also accept that even though we can't solve all the problems of the world, we've got to try and solve some of them. So for me, getting engaged in individual cases is often the best way of helping, because they shine a light on a bigger issue, perhaps. Only this morning, for instance, I've spoken to a lady in Pakistan, in Lahore, heartbreaking story about her 13-year-old daughter who was abducted and then forcibly converted and then raped inside what was supposedly a marriage of a 13-year-old to a man in his late 40s. And that mother is heartbroken about what has happened to her daughter, but it shines a light on a bigger problem of abductions and forced conversions. Last year it's estimated that 1,000 young Christian and Hindu girls from minority backgrounds were abducted. So although people like me can't do everything, we can do something about a case like that. I can't insist that Article 18, for instance, which Pakistan is signed up to, this is Article 18 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which insists that everyone has the right to believe, not to believe, or to change their belief. I can't insist that Pakistan upholds that law, even though they're signed up to the Universal Declaration, but I can take up an individual case that shows that they're not living by the spirit of it. So there is good in the world. And in the case of Pakistan, for instance, 2 years ago, I was able to go there. I met the Chief Justice, I met senior members of the courts there. There are good members of the judiciary. There are plenty of people who share my abhorrence at something like the abduction of this 13-year-old girl. And what we have to do is build alliances and coalitions with like-minded people in order to try and get some of these injustices and bad things put right.
It's now 22 years since the passage of the US International Religious Freedom Act. Would you give us a brief overview of where you believe the situation has improved for religious liberty and where it has worsened in that time?
Well, sadly, I'd want to start by talking about how it's worsened. Only a year ago, thanks to the initiative of our then Secretary of State for Foreign and Commonwealth Affairs, we set in motion an inquiry which was chaired by the Bishop of Truro, the Anglican Bishop of Truro, and which found that 250 million Christians are persecuted worldwide. So you think about the scale of that all over the world, and you can see that this is something that we've lost sight of, that is not a popular issue, it's not politically correct, it's one of those things that people turn a blind eye to. It's almost as though it sort of serves them right. In some secular circles, there is this sort of very negative view about people who embrace any kind of religious belief, and yet over 80% of the world say that they hold some form of religious belief. So we shouldn't allow this to be pushed to the margins or to the side. Have we seen any improvements? Well, we've seen parliamentarians starting to take more interest. At the Westminster Parliament, for instance, we founded a group of us, the All-Party Parliamentary Group on Freedom of Religion or Belief, and FORB, as it's often known, has become a central question. It's now one of the biggest groups in Parliament. People from left, right and centre have joined it, and we are able to make common cause about some of these cases. So it's not all bad news. But the sheer scale of what is happening, I mean, you think of a country like North Korea, which I visited, where 300,000 people, many of them there because of their dissenting religious or political beliefs, are in concentration camps. And the United Nations itself had an inquiry 3 years ago where it said that crimes against humanity are being committed. It said this is a state without parallel in the world. And yet, what is anyone doing about it? One of the recommendations of that report was that North Korea should be taken to the International Criminal Court. Needless to say, it's never happened. So there are structures in place, but it's making sure that they start to work more effectively than they have. In the United States, one of the best things that's happened in the last 4 years was the appointment of an old friend of mine, former Senator Sam Brownback, as the special ambassador, representative of the president, specifically tasked to raise the issue of freedom of religion or belief. And envoys like that have been appointed elsewhere in the world too. So pushing this issue up the political agenda, we can see that that is happening, but heavens, there's so much more that needs to be done.
Do you believe that the rising secularism of the West over the past 20 to 30 years, and particularly within its media class, has contributed to this almost blindness to what is going on in religious persecution around the world, and perhaps aided those who do persecute religious minorities?
I agree entirely. I think that we have seen a lot of indifference, but that is often driven by contempt for religious faith. And they need to ask themselves some searching questions. Why is it so unacceptable for someone to hold religious beliefs? If they're not trampling on the rights of others, if they're not abusing other people's freedoms, then surely they should be standing with us foursquare, asserting the rights to people to believe or not to believe. I mean, for instance, I've taken up the case of a young man called Alexander Ahn, who was imprisoned for 4 years in Indonesia. Why did I take that up? Not because of his religious belief, but because he's an atheist who said he wanted the right not to believe. And I think that's just as important as my right to believe. And I just wish people would accept the same principle. It really angers me when great universities, for instance, like the University of Oxford, no platform, English journalist like Tim Stanley from being able to come and speak at that university in a debate with someone holding a contrary point of view because he holds pro-life views, perhaps informed by his religious beliefs. Now, to prevent people from being able to express an opinion, well, that offends fundamental principles of free speech, but it also offends the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, Article 19 of which insists that we have the right to knowledge, we have the right to be informed, we have the right to share opinions. So I think that people of a particularly secular persuasion need to be a little less politically correct about the things that they care about, and not always try to attribute, for instance, to the atrocities in a country like Nigeria, where in northern Nigeria, Boko Haram, aided and abetted by the Fulani militias, the extreme Islamist organizations, and now the Al-Qaeda affiliate in northern Nigeria, have been mercilessly killing thousands and thousands of Nigerian Christians. And what do we hear from the secular world? Oh, it's all down to climate change. It's all down to the growth of populations. 11 Christians were murdered on Christmas Day. That wasn't climate change that did that. A young girl called Leah Sharibu was abducted, is still abducted, from her mother. She was the Christian girl who refused to convert when Boko Haram abducted her. And she has been raped, impregnated. Where is the world in demonstrating and complaining about these atrocities that are taking place? They don't do it because it's all about that young woman's religious faith. And it sometimes does seem to me that there are some commentators who don't just turn a blind eye, but actually are contemptuous of people with a religious faith and say, well, it's their fault. They bring these things upon themselves.
Perhaps the most signal instance at the moment of the media ignoring what is a clear process of religious persecution is that of the Uyghur minority of China, with which you've concerned yourselves. Could you perhaps give us an overview of the situation and why you believe that it is being ignored when it is so clearly leading to genocide?
I was the first parliamentarian in the House of Lords to raise the plight of the Uyghurs, and I've also, of course, raised the plight of the Muslim Rohingya, who have been so barbarously treated in Burma. Why does it matter? Well, the Uyghurs, there are nearly 1 million of them incarcerated in camps in Xinjiang. I've travelled in Western China and seen the situation firsthand in places like Tibet. And it's no coincidence that the man who was charged by the Chinese Communist Party with controlling Tibetan Buddhism has also now been put in control of the re-education of Uyghur Muslims. I mean, it is outrageous to force Muslim people, for instance, to eat pork. It's outrageous to re-educate them. It's outrageous to take the minarets and the domes off of their synagogues, to strip out anything that has any kind of religious resonance, and to tell people that to be a citizen of China that you have to conform. And of course they're not alone in this. The Falun Gong practitioners are in the same situation, and there are reports of forced organ harvesting of people who are Uyghurs and people who are Falun Gong, but also people from dissenting political and religious minorities right across the country. Sir Geoffrey Nice QC, one of the most eminent lawyers in the UK, chaired a commission of inquiry which reported last year, and he said this is a criminal state, and that any country dealing with the Chinese Communist Party should remember they are dealing with a criminal state. And he said that beyond any reasonable doubt, forced organ harvesting, where you take a knife to someone, you remove their organs, you kill them in the process, has been taking place in China. Why are we not indignant and outraged about these things? So what is happening to the Uyghurs is a harbinger of what has been happening to many people in China. Why are we not indignant about the young citizen journalist, the young woman who was arrested because she dared to shine a light on what had been happening with COVID in China? She disappeared. She's on a hunger strike even while we're conducting this interview. Why isn't the world speaking out about the indifference of the World Health Organization, for instance, in being aided and abetted in its dealings with the Chinese state? Why do we not say that we believe a genocide is unraveling in China? The 1948 Convention on the Crime of Genocide places on countries like the United Kingdom and the United States a duty to prevent, a duty to protect, and then a duty to punish. But you only need to think about what happened in northern Iraq, which I visited a few months ago, what happened to the Yazidis, what happened to the Christians there, and the real genocide that took place, or what happened to the Armenians a century ago, and which the United Kingdom has still not even recognised as a genocide, to realise the huge yawning gap that there is between the declarations we sign up to, the conventions that we promulgate, and the actions that we then take. So what's happening to the Uyghurs does matter because it's happening to human beings, but it also matters because you take away their right to religious freedom, and it plays out right across the piece. And we're seeing that right across China at the present time, and I think the world is only now beginning to wake up to the realities of Chinese communism and what it did after all during the Cultural Revolution to millions of its own people. We can see that being played out all over again.
What's your view of the relationship between the Catholic Church and the Chinese government at the moment, particularly with the control of bishops, for instance? Do you believe that this is a relationship that is constructive or destructive to the position of Christians in China?
I'm Vice Chairman of the All-Party Parliamentary Group on Uyghurs, but I also am Vice Chairman of the All-Party Parliamentary Group on Hong Kong. And the person that I listen to about the way that Chinese Catholics have been treated is the wonderful former Cardinal Archbishop of Hong Kong, Cardinal Zen, whom I've had the privilege to meet. Cardinal Zen has again and again says that you should not be dealing with the Chinese Communist Party. When I first went to mainland China as a young MP, I met people from the underground churches, but I was also taken to some wasteland to see someone who appeared at a window that night and gave the sign of the cross. And this was the former Archbishop, made a Cardinal in pectore by Pope John Paul II of Shanghai, and who had spent 30, 40 years of his life in prison. And Cardinal Kung represented for me the courage and the valour of the underground church. I've also met many Chinese Protestants from the unregistered churches who refuse to be told who to appoint as their ministers, who refuse to be told what they can and can't believe by the authorities in the Chinese Communist Party. So I think it's a betrayal of Christians to make a concordat with the Chinese Communist Party. I think our record, the Catholic Church's record of signing concordats, is not a very good one. You only have to think of the concordat that was made with Adolf Hitler to see what I mean. And I think this is a huge historical error, and we should be standing alongside those who have suffered so much for their faith.
How would you suggest that Catholics in their parishes and as laymen and women do something to bolster the Church in its opposition to China, should there be the need for this, which you clearly show there is?
One of the most wonderful agencies inside the Catholic world is Aid to the Church in Need, and for some years I served on its board. It does a lot of practical good and hard work alongside people on the ground. So I would suggest that people get involved in Aid to the Church in Need groups and make sure that practical things happen, but they can do more about advocacy as well. And that is why organisations that speak out and are not timid and not required to take Trappist vows about the things that they see happening in the world should engage them too. So organisations like Christian Solidarity Worldwide, which is a wonderful advocacy organisation, Jubilee Campaign, which I was a co-founder of, organisations that speak out and help to mobilise opinion. And young people especially should be doing more using the internet, using Twitter, using Facebook, setting up websites, speaking out and shining a light on the situation. It was Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who was the wonderful theologian who stood against Hitler and the Nazis, who famously said, "But not to speak is to speak, and not to act is to act." Bonhoeffer, of course, was executed by the Nazis. He did speak, he did act. We have extraordinary privileges and liberties and freedoms, and we should be putting them at the disposal of people who can't speak for themselves.
David, Lord Alton of Liverpool, thank you.
Thank you.
Hello, I'm Nina Shea. I direct the Center for Religious Freedom of the Hudson Institute in Washington, D.C., and I am speaking to you today from our offices. I'm delighted to be a co-chair of this important conference. I miss coming together in New York as we've done in past years, and I miss Cardinal Dolan's blessing in person. Hats off to Amanda Bowman for arranging an exciting program of important key voices and heroes for advancing religious freedom, and for overcoming obstacles, really serious obstacles, in bringing this conference together. She had to overcome the pandemic and the New York state quarantine. And then earlier this month, there was a tragic passing of our co-chair and cherished friend, Andrew Walther. I work closely with Andrew on defending the Christians of the Middle East from the effects of genocide of ISIS for several years. And he was, at that time, vice president of the Knights of Columbus, and I often thought of him as our white knight, because every time the Christians of the Middle East needed food or wanted to rebuild their destroyed villages, or Washington needed more evidence that there was a genocide occurring, Andrew would seem to pivot into action and come to the rescue. We will greatly miss him. I'll start our discussion by making a few remarks on China's churches. Until 3 years ago, scholars and prominent Christian voices in the West proclaimed China to have the world's fastest growing church. And they predicted that they said that China was on a trajectory to become the site of the largest church in the world by 2030. And since 2018, these voices have fallen silent. Though few are saying it, Chinese Christianity is being destroyed, diluted, and distorted. There is a new government campaign driven in Beijing to tamp down Christianity's overheated spread within its country. the underground churches, which account for the vast majority of the some 80 to 100 million Chinese Christians, are being crushed, while the government-permitted churches, the ones controlled by the Chinese Communist Party, are being turned into propaganda, indoctrination, and surveillance centers. I want to point out that China is oppressing religious groups across the board by various calibrated means. I believe that it is trying to eradicate the Uyghur Muslims in ways characteristic of genocide, mass concentration camps, forced abortions and sterilization, separation of children from their parents, and the destruction of their mosques and traditions. Under President Xi Jinping, it is trying to eliminate Christianity through administrative regulation and punishments, and by melding it with Chinese communist ideology. Typically, these measures are more subtle and less violent due to Western trade considerations, but they are no less effective in bringing the extraordinary Christian growth to a dead stop. China has also used insidious pressures to silence both Christians in China and here from criticizing this repression. So what are these measures, or these methods of repression against the churches? Well, number one, young people must now be banned from churches, deprived of sacraments, religious education, and Bible studies. Some schools are forcing students to take oaths of atheism. The faith will be difficult to perpetuate in the next generation under these conditions. Ministry and priesthood vacations will plummet. In 2018, government oversight of the Christian churches was transferred from the administrative bureaucracy to the Chinese Communist Party directly. Churches that resist CCP oversight are being bulldozed or secularized. Sermons must draw inspiration from communist thought and Xi's sayings. President Xi is ripping down crosses and images of saints within the churches and replacing them with portraits of himself. Facial recognition surveillance cameras are placed inside and outside of churches. The underground church, which has been more tolerated in recent decades, no longer is. All bishops, priests, and pastors must meet communist approval as a precondition of the Vatican-China Agreement of 2018, which was recently renewed. Pope Francis lifted the excommunication of the communist-picked Bishop Zhan Silu. This bishop was appointed to replace an underground bishop in Mingdong. He promptly led 33 diocesan priests to a formation course, quote unquote, at the Central Institute of Socialism with the Communist Party's local United Front. Bishop Zhan declared, "To carry out the Sinization of religion with determination, we must continue to follow a path that conforms to socialist society." And those who don't conform to the communist dictates are being hounded or persecuted out of the church, like the former bishop of Mindong, who went home in dejection, or underground Protestant pastor Wang Yi, who is now serving a 9-year prison sentence for criticizing communist control. Another pastor is on trial currently. There are about 30 underground bishops and a larger number of underground priests and Protestant pastors. On November 2, 2 priests from the underground church in Baoding and more than a dozen seminarians and nuns were arrested. The former vicar general of Baoding was also arrested. They have disappeared into detention. Their bishop, James Su Jimen, was taken into captivity in 1997 and is now one of the world's longest prisoners of conscience, confined longer than was Nelson Mandela. To leave the underground and be recognized by Beijing, Catholic priests must sign a government pledge of, quote, independence. That means independence from Vatican teaching and authority. A priest who refused was recently tortured with several days of sleep deprivation. Others are repeatedly sent to brainwashing sessions. Catholic priests are told by Chinese authorities that the Vatican Agreement, which remains secret, calls for church unity in the patriotic government church, which requires the blasphemous pledge that they are independent from the Vatican. So damned if they defy the Vatican in the underground, damned if they reject the Vatican in the pledge. Unbelievably, the terms of the Vatican Agreement that was renewed last month failed to address these critical issues. This explains what Cardinal Zen has said, that the agreement is killing the Chinese Catholic Church. Another measure of repression is that the Bible is censored from the internet. Even visitors are forbidden from bringing in Bibles for personal use. Unauthorized possession of Bibles results in their burning. The CCP is retranslating the Bible at the current moment, and it is expected to drop the book of Revelations and depict Jesus as stoning the adulterous woman. Maybe the passage of Jesus asking for the little children to come to him will be dropped as well. Heck, they could even censor out the verse in John, "The truth will set you free," since that's anathema to Chinese Communist Party values, which is China's standard for permissible speech. At the same time, the largest American Bible publishers are having millions of their Bibles published in China, in English, for Americans. If you have a Bible printed in the last several years, you may find that you have one by checking the copyright page. It will say printed in China. This is a very big business for China. It is now printing over 100 million Bibles a year for export and domestic use. It's also very profitable for American Bible sellers, and this may explain why so many Christian leaders are silent about the devastating impact of Xi's so-called sanitization campaign against the churches in China. Turning to China for our Bibles, while it is censoring and distorting the Bible for Chinese Christians, is an obscenity that should be curtailed. Finally, I just want to say that China's de facto annihilation of Hong Kong's sovereignty this year has been another real blow for the churches. Hong Kong has been a center of information and education for and on Chinese churches. Wherever you look, the status of religious freedom in China, there is evidence of the CCP's aggressive aggregation of totalitarian power. There is much more I could say, but will be said at this conference. I look forward to hearing the further insights on China from our distinguished speakers who will follow me. Thank you.
Good afternoon. I'm here with Guangcheng Chen, and we are so privileged to have time to interview with him this afternoon. So Guangcheng, I'm going to speak with you now about your experience, and I'm delighted that you can share your experience with this incredible audience today. We're honored to have you.
Thank you. I'm so happy.
In China, you campaigned against forced abortions and other horrific practices carried out pursuant to Beijing's one-child policy. What moved you to devote your life to protecting the unborn?
I have always felt moved to fight against injustice. I worked on many different kinds of social justice cases, beginning with the poor and disabled. Many of these cases were very successful, but as a result, the CCP was upset. In 2005, some people from my village told me about the violent one-child policy campaign taking place in Shandong. I was horrified and felt compelled to act. Women were being dragged from their homes in the middle of the night, shoved in vans, taken to clinics or hospitals to have their babies aborted or to be sterilized. Men were also forcefully sterilized. Families and relatives of couples who had, quote, overburst, were detained and tortured. Babies were aborted at all stages of pregnancy, even at full term. If they were born alive, they would have their necks broken. These cruelties defy the imagination, defy our basic humanity. I could not turn away. I had to stop it. It was a natural reaction to the brutality I saw around me.
Thank you. Yeah. You began an investigation into the practices of the policy. What was the result of that?
I began an investigation with the help of some friends. I hoped to expose the authorities, either through a lawsuit or through the media. We collected testimony from victims of the campaign. From our work, we estimated that in just 6 months, over 130,000 forced abortions and sterilizations had been performed in my region of Shandong, and an additional 600,000 people had been detained or tortured because of a familial relationship. We put our findings online. The CCP was infuriated. They did not want to be exposed. They had been lying to the West for many years about the forced abortions of the one-child policy. So they come after me. They kidnapped me, beat me, detained me, and imprisoned me for over 4 years. However, I believe our work was very successful. When I was in prison, an inmate told me that the CCP relaxed the campaign because of the pressure from our investigation. And many families had a second child. He said they would find me when I was out of prison to thank me. I was very moved to hear this. Also, when I was under house arrest in 2011, guards and officials were in our house 24 hours a day. An official said that because of our investigation, over 90,000 children had been born. He said that the party would make me pay for my, quote, wrongdoing. But I was not afraid. I was extremely gratified. Our work and our suffering had not been in vain.
Thank you. In a Wall Street Journal interview, you talked about what your father taught you about the lessons of the Zhao dynasty. Can you share with us what you learned from your father?
Okay. Because I could not see, I was not allowed to attend school as a child. So my father told me many stories and talked to me about the rise and fall of dynasties. At the beginning of a dynasty, rulers were concerned about the well-being of the people and tried to improve their lives. Then rulers became selfish and lost the support of the people. But without the will of the people, the dynasty would eventually collapse. This taught me about the natural laws behind the rise and fall of power. When a dynasty is corrupt, those in power try to suppress the people and try to control them. But a dynasty that ignores the will of the people will fail. Even emperors can be brought down.
Thank you. So, you were imprisoned for your advocacy. Can you describe your life in prison?
In prison, the CCP used the wardens to control me. The wardens told inmates they couldn't speak to me and ordered inmates to guard me. They pressured me to confess to crimes I did not commit. I refused to do this. Instead, I went every day to find the wardens. I insisted that they let me to talk to my lawyers and present my case to prosecutors as is the law. The wardens didn't like this. They ordered other inmates to beat me. They broke my ribs. All the while I was in prison, my wife and family were under house arrest. My lawyers were beaten multiple times when they tried to see me. In China, there is no rule of law inside prison and no rule of law outside of prison either.
No rule of law inside prison and no rule of law outside prison. So what was your experience under house arrest? You had already served your term in prison and then you came under house arrest afterwards. So what was that experience like?
Yes. After my sentence was up, I was sent home under guard. The entire village had become a prison. The CCP cut off our phone lines and installed cell phone jammers and high-definition video cameras. Guards ran our village on duty 24 hours a day. We could not leave our home, and no one could come in. Anyone who tried to enter the village would be beaten and robbed. My wife Regine and I made a video in secret talking about our situation and secretly got it out to a friend who put it online. When the CCP found out, they were enraged. They ordered 70 to 80 thugs into our home, and dozens of them threw my wife to the ground. They covered her with a quilt to muffle her cries and kicked her. Other thugs grabbed me. They stuffed a dirty rag in my mouth and beat me. This went on for hours. Before they left, they ransacked our home, taking anything they wanted. We were assaulted and robbed like this multiple times. In July of 2011, guards and officials moved into our house to abuse us 24 hours a day. They sat at our table and beside us as we slept. They wanted to intimidate us into giving into their demands that I stop exposing their crimes. They barricaded our windows. We were miserable and so angry, but we did not give in.
And now the moment that everybody wants to hear about. How did you escape?
That is a long story. For over a year, my wife Regine and I secretly observed the guards and our surroundings. We tried to escape many times, but also failed many times. Finally, on April 20th, 2012, a guard stood up to get some tea. For a few seconds, he blocked the view of the other guards in the yard. Just for a few seconds, Regine quickly grabbed my hand and led me to a corner just out of sight. From there, I began my escape alone. It took me more than 20 hours. I climbed over 8 walls and broke my foot. I crawled on my hands and knees through woods and across fields and streams. My clothes were torn and bloody. I crossed over a river to neighboring village. But I didn't know the village well. It was raining. Miraculously, I came upon the home of a friend who secretly notified my family. They helped me escape to Beijing before the guards even realized I had left my village. In Beijing, my friends helped me get to the American embassy, where I was finally safe. I was extremely lucky to be able to come to America with my family. Now we are free. I have described my life and my escape in my memoir, The Barefoot Lawyer.
Yes. That was a harrowing experience, and none of us can imagine how you did that, but here you are. Amazing. It was an amazing, amazing heroism.
Thank you.
Yes. So, after prison, you were kept under house arrest. The Wall Street Journal called your escape one of the most gripping stories in recent Chinese memory. Why did you decide to escape China?
I had no choice but to try to leave my home. When I escaped, I didn't know that I would end up at the US Embassy. But once I arrived at the embassy, and the American diplomats began negotiation with the CCP officials, we asked that the CCP investigate my treatment and guarantee my safety. But it became clear that they would never investigate. They only agreed to it in negotiations to make the Americans happy. Also, after a few days, the US policy towards me changed, and I had to leave the embassy. If I couldn't stay at the embassy, I would either be put back in prison or worse. The only choice I had was to come to America.
Well, you eluded capture while walking on a broken leg. What kept you going?
I was extremely upset when I broke 3 bones in my foot coming off a wall. I thought heaven let me out of my house, past the guards, but now I'm unable to walk. On top of being blind, I was distraught. However, I always knew I had to go on. I had to persevere. I would not bow to fear. I never considered giving up. This is part of my personality. I've always felt that in any situation, you can find a way out. You just need to try. This thinking helped me immensely in that difficult time.
Yes, it definitely did. I think that there's probably not one of us who is listening to you that can imagine living through what you've lived through. We're so impressed. So, well, now that you live in the United States, what surprised you most after you moved here?
I'm knowing that there is infiltration by the CCP in the US, but I never thought it would be to this degree. Not only in academia, government, media, business, etc. I have been criticized for speaking about it when I was at NYU. I said very carefully that academic institutions around the US had come under pressure from the CCP because of their relationships with the CCP. At first, no one believed me, and many people were mad at me. But later, Congress did an investigation, and now many universities in the US have closed their Confucius institutes, which are sharp power of the CCP. And the US government is looking closely at visas and connections between 13 scientists and the CCP military. Now there is change in the US. People are beginning to see, but much more needs to be done. We need to stop the CCP from changing America, from changing the West.
Thank you. So, Guangcheng, what do you think is the biggest difference between China and the US?
Yeah, very different. Yeah. In China, the country has been kidnapped by the Communist Party. The CCP operates a party-state system where the party is above the law, above the government. The media, government, and judiciary are all controlled by the CCP. The people have no freedom and are not protected by the law and cannot change the government or their leaders through elections. In China, the law is window dressing at best and at worst a tool to maintain the regime's control. The US is flawed, but its democratic systems and structures allow society to improve. Corruption in the US can be exposed and people can be held responsible. Sometimes this process takes a long time, but at least it is possible for it to happen.
Well, if you could speak to the Chinese people, what would you say?
In fact, a lot of I want to see, but the important is, I would say we must protect our rights. Only through our efforts will we protect our rights, and only if we stand up to oppose the regime will other people reach out to help us. If we do everything we can to bring about democracy, others will assist us, but we must fight for our rights. It starts with us. I would also say, put away our fear. The regime controls you by fear. Overcome fear, and together we can bring a bright future to China.
Wonderful. What do you want the American people to know about China?
Yeah, that is important. Not just think about me. First, I want Americans to know that the CCP is not the same as China. The CCP is not the same as the Chinese people. The CCP does not represent the Chinese people. I hope Americans understand that the CCP regime is not a government as people assume it is, like government of other nations. The party controls all aspects of the country, and the people must work in the service of the party. It doesn't matter if you are rich or poor. If you oppose the regime, you will not survive. I also want Americans to see that the CCP regime is not only dangerous for the Chinese people, but to all of humanity. The coronavirus should make that clear. The virus originated in China, but even to this day, the CCP refuses to be transparent about the origins of the disease. If they truly wanted to cooperate in the international community, they would have immediately let observers and scientists in to understand what was happening and how the virus operates. But instead, they blocked information and locked up people who wanted to tell the truth. The result is a disease that continues to ravage the world. If the CCP treats the Chinese people with such cruelty and disregard, then why would they treat the rest of the world any best? Do not trust their propaganda and lofty words. As long as the CCP exists in the world, the entire world is at risk. I hope Americans will stand with the Chinese people to throw the CCP into the trash heap of history.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Guangcheng, thank you. It's
Thank
just
you.
such a privilege to hear from you and your experience. We are very, very grateful. Thank you for
Thank
your
you.
courage and for sharing with us.
When you hear about the witness of Chen Guangcheng and others who have been referred to, one is amazed at the resilience of the human spirit. But do you see any possibility that there will be any reconciliation between the Chinese government and people of faith? Do you see any way of a change in policy that makes it more advantageous for them to tolerate rather than to persecute?
Well, first of all, Amanda, thank you so much for inviting my wife and me to this. This is such an important event because the persecution of Christians in China, persecution of others in China, and persecution of people of faith around the world has just gotten so much worse. I don't believe that it's possible to have a reconciliation between the Communist Party and people of faith, because communism has always been hostile to religion. It sees it as a competitor, and what we witness in China right now is Xi Jinping, the Chinese ruler, not only wants to control religion, he actually wants to eliminate it. And we see this because of the acts that he's taken. And not just against Christians, but also against Uyghurs, against Tibetans. There's a common theme that runs on this impression, and one of it is that they don't allow children to worship, to study God, or to study faith of any type. So that's a real attempt to let this sort of play out, let older adherents die, and then to completely eliminate faith. Now, that's not possible. The Chinese Communist Party can't win on something like this, but that's their plan. And so we have to understand that this, for people of faith, is an existential fight.
I was in Shanghai for Christmas 5 years ago, and my husband and I went to Mass at a Jesuit church in Shanghai. And the church, it was a very, very cold day, and the church had no heating at all, and it was freezing. And I looked out at the congregation and I realized that I was one of the very few people in that church who'd never suffered for their faith. There were elderly people, there were very young children. The service was partially in Latin and in Chinese, and there was a long sermon in Chinese. We were all so cold. But they were there. And there were children there, and you had a multi-generational sense in that church of multi-generations carrying on the faith. I guess that now that situation has changed, and this Christmas, will there be church services of that kind, or will they, or what will it be like?
There will be church services for foreigners, but the question is, there's not going to really be church services as we think about them for people in China. You know, we've heard a lot from Lord Ogden about the agreement between Pope Francis and the Communist Party. Really what is going on here, I think, is that as the Communist Party squeezes organized religion, people of faith will then prey on their own. In China, there are 5 officially recognized religions and religious structures to correspond to that. And 2 of them are Christian. One's Catholic and the other is Protestant. And what's happened is, as Xi Jinping has exercised more control over the official churches, people have left the official churches and started to pray on their own. So, for instance, you heard Nina talk about trying to sinicize religion. In other words, to take out religious content from the organized services and to replace them with Communist Party propaganda. to replace pictures of Jesus with those of Xi Jinping that you mentioned, to take away the symbols of religion. And the Communist Party can do that because it does have total control. But what happens is that people said, no, I'm not going to go to this service. I'm going to pray on my own. And that's why you've had the flowering of the underground church. Yes, it's persecuted, but because it's persecuted, it grows, and it grows uncontrollably. And the party doesn't have the ability to influence it like they do in the official churches. So, Nina talked about some of the estimates of the number of people who are of faith, and she mentioned there's perhaps somewhere like 98 million Christians. And that could very well be true. That's, by the way, more than the number of members of the Communist Party, which is a little over 91 million. But the party doesn't control these. These are house churches. 6 people, 7 people, 8 people meet on their own. They meet beyond the supervision of the authorities. And they pray. And they pray from 8 in the morning to 5 in the evening. And when they leave, they feel bad that they can't stay more. This is a fervor that the Communist Party once had when it came to power. But it doesn't have it anymore. And the party is deathly afraid of the religions, especially the underground Protestant church. And I think what's going to happen as the Communist Party and the Vatican come to terms and work more closely, you are going to see Catholics in China leave the official church and do what the Protestants have been doing, which is praying on their own. And so you'll have a stronger Catholic faith in China, but it might not be one that has relations with the Vatican. It will be on its own. It'll be like the early church after Jesus. It will be strong. It'll be resilient. It will grow. And the Communist Party will be deathly afraid of it.
I'm thinking of the gospel of when 2 or 3 are gathered in my name. I can only hope that we obviously, in the Catholic Church, the importance of the sacraments means that it has a different emphasis than a Protestant emphasis on the word. And so it's the continuation of the sacramental life that I think we are most concerned about.
Well, I'm a Protestant, and so, I can sort of understand what's going on in the Protestant church. And the sacraments, this is not something that I was brought up with, though my wife was, because she was brought up with a Catholic in Hong Kong. But we don't know how this is going to evolve. But you could see, for instance, that Catholics who believe, in the formalism of the church, they probably will develop that on their own. And that, I think, is going to occur because people are going to pray. They are going to want to talk to God. They're going to want to do it without the intervention of the Communist Party. And so I think they'll develop their own sacraments that they will do them themselves. So you will have basically what looks like a Catholic service, but it won't be one which reports to the official patriotic Catholic Church. And it will be a strong Catholic.
Well, I think that we've certainly had an example in Cheng Guancheng, the incredible resilience of the human spirit, and that is something to be grateful for. And just as a matter of interest, he is a dean, I think it is now, at the Catholic University of America. And he speaks to the resilience and bravery of the human spirit. And I think that's something that we should all take part in. And we're going to change our topic now from the Middle Kingdom and an ancient land to another ancient land. And we're very lucky today to have some speakers who are here with us in person. So I'm going to give a minute for us to shift and introduce our next set of speakers. The Middle Kingdom is not the only ancient land that has a suffering Christian population. So do the lands that were the true cradle of Christianity, including those who speak the language of our Lord. The defeat of ISIS and other Islamists offer the last hope of recovery for Christian groups threatened with extinction, most of whom would not survive another attack similar to the one in 2014 that drove 120,000 Christians out of northern Iraq. Happily, following the decisive defeat of ISIS, some 40,000 Christians have returned to Christian towns and villages in the Nineveh plain. However, as we will learn from Archbishop Border speaking to us from Erbil, the future is bleak. Likewise, half of Syria's pre-civil war Christian population of 2.5 million have fled the country. And today, more Arab Christians, some 20 million, live outside the Middle East rather than remain in the region where there is approximately 15 million. And then there's Lebanon, always teetering on the brink of being a failed state, which suffered its catastrophic explosion in August this year. Here to moderate our conversation on these matters with our in-person speakers, Bishop Mansour, Robert Nicholson of the Philos Project, and our moderator, Michael Lasavita of the Catholic Near East Welfare Association. And we will also hear testimony from Stephen Roche, one of my co-chairs, who, with Andrew Walter, has been the founder of the Institute for Ancient and Threatened Christianity. He will speak to Archbishop Border. So now the biographies of our distinguished speakers are all in our program, and I don't want to waste time going over these again. I think it's much more important to hear from them. So that's what we're going to do now. Michael.
Amanda, thank you very much. How do I sound with the mask on? Fine? Great. So I'll keep it on. Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us this afternoon. And thank you, as always. This is the 5th year now for this forum, and it grows and grows. This year it's growing, of course, virtually, with EWTN's presence, and we thank them for their interest in broadcasting this. Without further ado, we have two really interesting voices with us this afternoon. Bishop Gregory Mansour is the epic for Maronite Catholics in the eastern half of the United States. There are estimated to be about 80,000 who belong to parishes in this part of the country, but when Bishop Gregory first came on board as epic, how many years ago? 16. He instituted a census, and I think there were at that point about 1 million who had determined Maronite Catholics in the United States. And of course, so many of them over the years have been assimilated, either becoming Roman Catholics, meaning Catholics of the Latin tradition, or Orthodox, or perhaps nothing at all. But the role of assimilation, the phenomenon of assimilation of Middle East Christians from their homelands coming to the West, whether it's in America or in Oceania, is something of grave importance as we see the numbers of Christians leaving the region. What does it mean to be a Maronite, but a Maronite in Brazil, but a Maronite in Rome? So we have Bishop Gregory, who is just a wonderful shepherd for that community in the eastern half of the United States. And then we have Robert Nicholson, who leads a movement, Philos, that is doing outstanding work in raising awareness, particularly among the young adults, and more than just that, young professionals, and even middle-aged people like myself, about what is happening in the region, and the need to advocate, and the need to support, and to be aware of what is happening in the Middle East, but in the ancient lands of Christianity. And just before we go into this, Bishop Gregory is going to speak first about the Synod, the gathering of bishops from throughout the Maronite world. Maronite Church is a universal church. Its bishops are scattered almost all over, I think maybe with the exception of Antarctica. And the patriarch, the father of that church, who is in Bukarki in Lebanon as his residence, summoned his bishops for a synod, an important meeting of his bishops for counsel and direction. And so we want to talk about that, and then Robert is going to speak about Armenia. Armenia is the first Christian nation. It is going through right now some difficulties. It is a tiny country of fewer than 2.5 million people. But Armenia itself is just a truncated. What exists today as a state is actually quite small compared to Greater Armenia that at one time its cultural stretch and its geographic presence stretched into eastern Anatolia, which is today parts of Turkey, and into areas of the southern Caucasus, not just in the traditionally defined borders of Armenia, but into Nagorno-Karabakh, where we have just had a cessation of hostilities there. So that's our game plan, and then we're going to hear from the Archbishop, the Chaldean Catholic Archbishop of Erbil, which is in Kurdistan. It's not in Iraq proper, well, it's in Iraq proper, but it's in the Iraqi part, autonomous part of Iraq. And it was to that area that so many Christians from the Nineveh plain near Mosul, homeland of Noah, Jeremiah and a few others, certainly the land of Abram and Ur of the Chaldees, where they fled when they were flushed out by ISIS on August 6th, 7th, and 8th, 2014. So without further ado, Sayed.
Thank you, Michael. And thank you, Amanda, and everybody who worked to bring this together. I'm mindful very much of our friend Andrew. May God rest Andrew in peace. So I'd like to give you a little perspective, not so much about the Maronite Church, but about Lebanon, and from a particular point of view, Christian Muslim. And so this brief reflection, I've been thinking a lot about this, and bear with me for just a couple minutes as I give you some things to think about. In most conferences on persecuted Christians, we speak about infractions on the God-given right of freedom to worship, as well as freedom of conscience. That is, to live openly and freely one's faith. These unjust restrictions are true of overly secular countries, where it's considered discrimination, and in some places people are no longer allowed to hold a principled or a reasonable approach to moral issues. This is also true in socialist countries, such as some places in South and Central America. And it's also true in communist countries, such as China and Southeast Asia. And it is certainly and unfortunately true in many Islamic countries, such as Saudi Arabia, Iran, Turkey, Afghanistan, Pakistan, and others. In this brief section of our seminar, we focus on the Middle East, the ancient lands of the Middle East. Thus, I would like to focus my brief remarks on the Islamic world and the sad reality that in every Islamic country, Christians and Jews have left. They found no safe harbor, no protection, no respect for their otherness, nor for their status as citizens. And this is a sad but old story, and rather depressing. Likewise, what happened over 100 years ago, namely the Armenian, Syriac, Assyrian, and Lebanese genocide at the hands of those at the time responsible in the Ottoman Empire, is even more distressing. And the bad news is that Christians have suffered at the hands of Muslim rulers, from the Mamluks to the Mongols to the Ottomans, and even at the hand of non-governmental militias, Al-Qaeda, Al-Shabaab, ISIS, Boko Haram, and the list goes on and on. However, I just gave you the bad news. I want to focus on a more positive note. And that's something that also happened around 100 years ago. An experiment, a wondrous example of hope. That was the establishment of modern-day Lebanon. The Maronite patriarch, Ilyas Hawaii, at 74 years old, led a delegation to Versailles, France, to urge, along with his Muslim Mufti counterpart, to urge the Allied countries to recognize Greater Lebanon. The boundaries that they proposed were intentionally inclusive: Shiite, Sunni, Christian, Druze. The nation, they said, would live in a conviviality, which years later Pope John Paul II would remark, even in the midst of the civil war of Lebanon, that Lebanon is, quote, more than a country, a message. The elderly Maronite patriarch made that dangerous trek to Versailles, saying he was not a political man. He was armed only with two things: one, his love for his fellow countrymen, and the rosary. This hope for a different world in the Middle East is what still abides in the hearts of Christians today, living in Lebanon and throughout the Middle East. They are armed with only love for their homeland and their faith in God and their reliance on the Blessed Virgin Mary. Thus, I ask, politically incorrectly, my Muslim brothers in Saudi Arabia and in Iran, both countries engaged in a fratricidal battle over hegemony in the region. And I ask also, politically incorrectly, my Muslim brothers in Turkey, leadership there, seemingly intent on reclaiming the triumphal memory of the Ottoman Empire. And lastly, I ask my Muslim brethren, all of goodwill, if this dream of Lebanon common to Muslims and Christians was just a mirage, or can it be not just the dream of Christians throughout the Middle East to remain in their homelands, but can it be a shared dream of Christian and Muslim alike? Lastly, whatever the answer is to that question, we Christians will stay, whether wanted or not, in the Middle East. It seems to be the story of our lives as Christians ever since Mary and Joseph were told that there is no room at the inn. There seems to be little to no room for us in the Islamic world. Nonetheless, it will be a great loss to this world if Christians are absent from their homelands. The great good that the ancient Christian communities have offered to their societies way before the advent of Islam and continue today, schools, hospitals, nursing facilities, charitable efforts that we Christians have been known for and continue to this day. It will be a sad day to see Christians no longer welcomed in their own homeland. Thank you.
Thank you, Bishop. Food for thought, and we're going to get back to that. Robert, I'd love to hear about well, Bishop brought up the rise of neo-Latin. How is that impacting on what are your observances?
Well, first of all, thank you, Michael, and Bishop Mansour, Amanda, Vicky, for organizing this, and it's great to be here in the spirit of Andrew, and unfortunately he's not here in person. We loved him and respected him and all that he's done. I don't think we'll all fully grasp what that was. We are meeting just a few weeks after really one of the most tragic, yet least little-known episodes in the broadly tragic history of Christians in the Near East, and that is the war that took place between Azerbaijan and Turkey on one side and the Armenian people, specifically those Armenian people of Artsakh, on the other. This is, there was a video that went, it's viral, that made the rounds on social media of I'm sure some of you saw it. It was a group of Christians gathered holding hands in front of a very old ancient church. I'm not sure which church it was, in the mountains of Artsakh. Holding hands and singing one last hymn before going into exile. These people are standing in front of this church not entirely sure that they'll ever see this church again. And for me, this image was poignant as a Christian, but I think as an American, it felt like an indictment. Because here's this small remnant of a Christian nation that has been beaten down, not just by two Turkish or Turkic states, but by two American allies. This is what I felt when I watched that video. And because of the election, because of COVID, because of all the many things we have going on, all of which are important, we just didn't pay attention. We didn't pay attention. And 6 weeks of war happened with very little protest from the U.S. State Department, the usual concerns and regrets and all those sorts of things. And what bothered me the most was that the usual reason for inaction, talking now about U.S. inaction for Christians in the region, wasn't even present. And that reason is the very complicated entanglement, the Bishop is referring to it, of Christians in Muslim-majority countries. It could be, in some cases, a very precarious regime that the State Department, the White House is afraid to meddle with because it's so fragile. If we help Christians, it'll actually make the situation much worse. It'll stoke sectarian tensions. In other cases, it's that we have some kind of relationship with the ruler, an autocrat in most cases, and we're trying to leave well enough alone. We're trying to not poke the bear too much. But Armenia and Artsakh don't have those problems. These are Christian areas. These are Christian countries. There's no reason why we could not do something, not least of all because, like I said, these are our allies, our alleged friends. And, I don't know about you, but when I have something that I need a friend to do, I pick up the phone and call that friend and say, hey, could you, in this case, not invade this ancient Christian homeland? And there are very artful ways to do that. I think some people think of doing nothing and then sending the army to parachute in. There are about 50 steps between the one and the other, and I don't think that we took two of them. It's a source of deep shame for me as an American. And I think that it should be, for all of us, a big wake-up call. And should really change the way that we think about engaging on this issue. I have to say that there's something very depressing about getting the invitation to this event every year. Not because I don't like to come, I do very much. I love seeing everyone who comes. But because I realize, wow, this is the 5th year, and where are we? What's different? This president who's leaving office now, there were some great things that were done, but there's no question to me that the Christian communities of the region are worse off than they were 4 years ago, writ large. And so what do you do? What lessons do we draw from this terrible experience? For me, there are two. One is the unique threat of Turkey, and the second one is the unique opportunity in Armenia. Briefly, Turkey, I don't think I need to tell this crowd, Turkey is increasingly, this is an understatement, increasingly problematic for any number of reasons. And even if you put the Christians of the Near East aside, Turkey is a rogue actor and a very dangerous threat to Europe, to America, and yes, to the minorities of the region. You see them in Syria, unfortunately there with tacit U.S. approval. You see them in Libya. You see them in the Eastern Mediterranean, bothering Greece, bothering Cyprus. You see them, of course, in Armenia, in Artsakh. You see them supporting Islamist groups like Hamas and what have you. Behind almost every door in the building that I work, metaphorically, is Prime Minister or President Erdogan. Turkey is the problem. I think we're going to be dealing with Turkey, if left unchecked, for the next 10 years, and the deck will be stacked even less in our favor the longer that we wait. The time to do something is now. And unfortunately, our policymakers and our leaders are so worried about keeping Turkey in the West, as they say, or pushing them further in the other direction, that they turn a blind eye when these sorts of things happen. The second thing is the unique opportunity of Armenia. I think there are three areas to really focus on, not to exclude any others, but when we're thinking about the future of Near Eastern Christian communities, they are Egypt, Lebanon, and Armenia. Egypt because it has the largest raw number of Christians in the region, the biggest Christian community. Lebanon because it has the highest percentage, the highest sort of critical mass, if you will. And Armenia because Armenia has something that neither of those countries, or really Christians in any other part of the region, maybe with the exception of Greece and Georgia, have, which is sovereignty. They have political independence. There is a place, there is a government, there are borders, there's a military. This is something that I'm sure the Maronites of Lebanon would love to have, these sorts of accoutrements. And we are not taking nearly enough advantage of that situation. People don't know this, but Armenia is actually quite friendly to foreign investment. And although there are lots of things, and I could list them, that I think the U.S. government should do, there is absolutely no reason why, we're sitting in New York City, how many miles from Wall Street, why American Christian businessmen and women could not pool their resources. They should do this in Lebanon as well, but invest in Armenia. This is a Christian country. This is a place where you can create businesses. You can partner with local Armenians. And guess what? The more that you do that, the more vested interest the U.S. government has in protecting Armenia. It's a whole digression I won't go into. So I think there are government things that we should do to take advantage of this unique opportunity. I think there are private industry things, and the more that I've seen successive administrations, successive presidents of both parties fail to really deliver, the more I'm believing that the answer is in the private sector. Lastly, I would say that there's a spiritual component, and I think we'd all be kidding ourselves if we thought that the only solution for these Christians is in politics or the militaries. There is a need for, I think, a re-evangelization for so many of these communities, because the thing that keeps them strong is actually not the borders, it's not the numbers, it's the gospel, it's the church, it's their faith, it's what keeps all of these peoples going. And I think that sometimes we in this advocacy space, and now I'm maybe preaching to myself, have a tendency to forget that, and to forget to encourage the very thing that makes these communities special to begin with. So I think it's a wake-up call. It's demoralizing in one way, but I think it brings a certain kind of clarity, like so many other things in 2020. When you see the world kind of pressed up against the ropes, there's a better idea about what it is that needs to happen next. So I know for our part of Philos, we're really trying to figure out, okay, how do we do this and really take it from the level of rhetoric into action, diversify it even away from government into the private sector.
It's interesting, you both use the word mirage. Is the Lebanese experiment a mirage? Used in other contexts. Wondering, is the idea of a secular Turkey a mirage? Because that's what they were told it was. This was a secular regime imposed out of Turk. It was something that was not religious. Could you please comment, Bishop, on that?
I would love to, because that's a good thought. Is it a mirage? Power is a mirage. Some dreams are a mirage. But if you remember early Christianity, the Roman Empire was so powerful. Christians had no hope of surviving. But even before Constantine made it legal to be a Christian, there were Christians all over the Mediterranean basin, and even with the help of the Assyrian Christians, all the way to China. So there's mirage, yeah, mostly power. But there's also, as Robert said, the power of the gospel that can, as one of our speakers was saying earlier, China is waking up to the message of the gospel, even in small groups. And so I am hopeful. And I'm also hopeful because there are Christians who still desire to stay in their places, even in the most difficult of times, and make a difference.
Thank you. Now we just have a few seconds before we are going to see from Iraq, we're going to see from Bishop, correct? I just want to say something about what both of you gentlemen said, and it's something that we cannot forget, and that is the power of the gospel. I've been to Armenia several times, and then spent a lot of time also in Georgia. And both of those countries are very conscious of the fact that they are Christian nations surrounded by Islam. They don't have a hostile view of Islam, not at all. It's a natural thing. But they're very conscious of their Christian identity, even though the two of them don't necessarily get along as well as they could or should. But there's a story that I will never forget, and that's being in a tiny village in southern Georgia, what they call a Frankish village. Franks because they're Catholics, Armenian Catholics. There's a section of Georgia, 80% of its population is Armenian, and a good portion of those Armenians are Catholics. And throughout the communist period, while the Apostolic Church and the Orthodox Church were undeniably and contestably persecuted by the communists, the Catholic Church was systematically decimated. And in some of those villages, those churches were just locked up. And what's interesting about Armenian communities, because of their friendship and their cultural affinity with things Russian, you can't forget that the role of Russia here is important in Armenian life. The men would go off to Russia to work and leave their wives and their children and their parents home. There's always a woman who would lead the community in prayer. And Amanda said something very important in the last conversation. Your sacramental theology is so important to us as Catholics and to Orthodox. They didn't forget the sacraments, but what held them together was their Catholic identity and the rosary. What is interesting is, despite the fact of 70 years of persecution, certainly lots of sects coming in and out of Armenia and Georgia these days, Jehovah's Witnesses, etc., seeking to, with Western funds, to expand or certainly preach their form of the gospel. Their Catholicity, their sense of Catholic identity remains very strong. And it's thanks to the power of prayer and understanding what the gospel means. So it's a really good point that you brought up, and that is what gives us hope. Certainly Catholic Mary's Welfare, it's all about the gospel for us. It boils down to that. So thank you very much.
Your Eminence, my dear brother bishops, distinguished guests, and friends. I am pleased to participate with you all in this important conference today, and I give my thanks to the Anglosphere Society as organizing this event. In particular, I extend my thanks to Amanda Bowman and Nina Shea for their continued efforts in the middle of this time of great difficulties. Before I begin, I must take time to remember our most dear friend Andrew Walter, in whose memory this conference is dedicated. Truly, the persecuted religious minority of Iraq had no greater friend. That Andrew passed from us on All Saints' Day was, in my mind, not by chance. We shall miss him beyond words. Moving now to the current situation in Iraq as it impacts the religious minorities, we must begin by realizing that in times of trouble, it's always the most vulnerable who suffers the worst. For displaced Christians and Yazidis in Iraq, acknowledged as a victim of genocide at the hands of ISIS, our trouble do not seem to end, but to continue and multiply. international war, followed by civil war, followed by violent persecution and displacement, followed by even more violent war, and then genocide, followed by mass displacement and economical ruin, followed by mass immigration and disappear, followed now by pandemic, continued displacement, economical disaster, and for too many of our people, a growing loss of hope. It pains me greatly to say this, but I must be honest with you. We Christians of Iraq are now down to our last remnant people, less than 250,000 by all counts. And should the world forget us in this time, it's quite likely that we will have disappeared by the time the world chooses to look upon us again. And yet, as for now, we are still here, still working with whatever strength, courage, and hope that we are able to still find. Years ago, I said, history will say, how did we let this happen? That is, why and how did we let Christianity disappear from Iraq? In a recent Yazda anniversary Zoom conference attended by senior Europeans and US representatives, I said, your consulates are 2 or 3 hours drive from Sinjar and Nineveh Plain, yet we are disappearing from our homeland in front of you. Something is clearly not working. We would ask you to think about it and give us your collective answers. I know these are uncomfortable words, but they were honestly spoken as they are again here today. Yes, something clearly is not working, and it's a mixture of things from problems in one's own country, shortage of humanitarian funds, no continued focus, lack of real international awareness, no livelihood programs and dignity of life, unfair competition, and justice to security. This list could go on. You can only revive an economy on creation of jobs, and there remains a high percent unemployment in the Christian villages, as there have been no livelihood programs of any significance since the right to return to their villages in June 2017. How can a people who have been living off their saving since August 2014 lead a life of dignity and hope? We are still here working with faith, strength, courage, and hope, and those great martyrs before us showed us the way. Their example taught us to persevere through this suffering, to remain faithful, and to place our efforts in Christ's service. The Church in Iraq has sought to help in every way we can in these past years in providing of medical care, education, housing programs, food programs, and peace-building efforts. We have openly stated and pledged our forgiveness to our tormentors, and tried as best as we are able not to become subject to culture of dependency, which ultimately takes from all our people the dignity which God intended for us. Yet, for all our efforts to remain as a contributing and thriving community against all these difficulties, it's clear that we will continue to need help and protections from our friends around the world, while at the same time we will continue to need to show that we are worthy of this help, not perpetual beggars, but honest and faithful members of Iraqi culture fabric, with obligations and responsibilities of our own. In this, we are not indifferent to the great sufferings of so much of the rest of the world. It's a time of great trouble, historic and global suffering. Despair and lack of hope threatens much of the world. In Lebanon, my dear brother Bishop Gregory looks upon a country on the edge of collapse and fears greatly of the safety and future of the innocent there. In Nigeria, my brother Bishop Matthew sees a country not only at the edge of collapse as well, but his own people continually and brutally subject to a violence and genocide that in many ways is worse, dare I say it, than what we have seen in Iraq. Our friends who will speak to you of the situation in China have equally concerning stories to tell. Will the great world takes a role in defending all of these innocents? And let me be clear by this, I do not mean a superficial and throwaway concerns of hashtags and social media posts. I mean specifically the ensuring of the most fundamental human concerns: security, food, medicine, education, employment, and honest civil government, and yes, freedom of religion. Meanwhile, in America, in a country we all look to for leadership and stability, we see a deeply fractured country. And not only do we see these political fractures, but also we see now the acts of destruction and physical attacks on religious symbols and institutions. For us, these things are not simply random events. Our bitter experience teaches us that these are calling cards for a far greater danger that lies at the end of this dark path. This danger seems now spreading throughout Europe, and now we see its footprints in the US as well. For those vulnerable religious minorities around the world which looks to America, I must say this honestly, all of this frightens us. We worry greatly about what is come. Will the future of our small and vulnerable communities be forgotten now amidst all of the larger concern and priorities in this polarized world? Again, I say to you, it's always the most vulnerable that suffers the worst. We Christians of Iraq pray that the political situation in the US will follow a peaceful and stable process. As the Church, we are non-partisan and do our best always to remain free from politics. But we cannot deny that the present administration has shown to us a help and solidarity which we had not seen before in any of the prior administrations, be they Democrats or Republican. Will this continue? We pray that it will be so. In this, we are encouraged by the fact that our support in these past 4 years has come from both Republicans and Democrats. H.R. 390, the Iraqi and Syrian Genocide Relief Act, which provided the foundation for meaningful help to the affected Christians and Yazidis countries, was passed unanimously in both the Congress and the Senate. While the current administration has been clear in its support for us, likewise, we have received solidarity from many leading members of the Democrats Party including leaders in both the House and the Senate. We hope and pray that this solidarity may continue and that we will not be forgotten or cast aside in the uncertainty ahead. While fully respecting that the present process is not yet final, for now we are looking for a sign from any new administration to what concern, if any, they will have for the situation of religious minorities around the world and in Iraq. Will religious freedom and the protection of vulnerable religious minorities be a priority in a new administration? We hope to see clear messages for this issue. We have no doubt that those who would seek to harm the innocents watch for these messages as well. And as Iraq moves towards new elections, in which the time of a deep systematic corruption, armed militias, and state-supported religious factions may finally begin to come to an end. This election may provide the last chance for Iraq to begin joining the world of responsible nations. We look also with concern regarding the economic help to our devastated communities who struggle so greatly to create new livelihoods and to stabilize rebuild their destroyed towns and villages. Particularly in this past 18 months, we have seen real help coming from USAID and the US State Department, help which have begun to make fundamental progress for our people. These programs and other similar investment and capacity building efforts are critical to any future that remains for our people to continue a life of dignity and meaning in Iraq. While our numbers are now small, we have still in Iraq a core of people, many of them young people, who have a commitment to remain in Iraq and to take their rightful and responsible place within a historical, cultural fabric of this land. I believe that if we are able to maintain some help and some hope for economic opportunity along with protection and freedoms as equal citizens, these young people will stay and our 2,000 year history of Christianity in Iraq will continue. In closing, I reach out to you all of you participating in this conference and also to those viewing us online. We are all brothers and sisters in this time. Let none of us forget the difficulty and pain of one another. I pray that someday we can all meet in person as God's children. That time will return when we can show our common humanity with each other. Thank you and God bless you all. Let us remember and never forget Andrew.
In the past two segments, we've been focusing on Christianity in ancient lands. Now we're going to be talking about a young faith community, sub-Saharan Africa, with particular attention to Nigeria. And the recent news reports about Christian persecution coming out of Nigeria are horrifying and continuous. While the world has been consumed by news about Iran, China, and conflicts in other regions, Nigeria's militant and extremist groups have waged a campaign of death and devastation against Christians. Every year, hundreds of Nigerian Christians are being assaulted, tortured, and killed by Fulani extremists in the Middle Belt region of the nation. In 2019 alone, an estimated 1,350 Christians were killed by militant Islamic groups in Nigeria, according to Open Doors. Reports from the ground indicate that the Fulani were at least 500, were responsible for at least 500 of these deaths. Most recently, the Fulani attacked 2 villages, setting a church building ablaze and killing at least 26 people. This young, precious Christian community is at risk, and we have today a report from the front line from Steve Rash, whose organisation, the Institute for the Ancient Threatened Christianity, which he co-founded with Andrew Walter, is in the midst of completing a report on the conditions in Nigeria. And this part of the report is going to be focusing mainly on the humanitarian conditions. We also are fortunate to have from Bishop Matthew Pukar, known to many people in this room, and Stephen Inada, who is the founder in Washington of the Nigerian group advocating for Christians in Washington, D.C. And then we're going to close with a witness testimony from Mariam Ibrahim, whom I will introduce separately. So let's begin with Steve. Thank you.
Good afternoon. My name is Stephen Rasha, and I'm the Vice Chancellor at the Catholic University of Erbil in northern Iraq. And I'm the co-founder and executive director of the Institute for Ancient and Threatened Christianity, or IATC. I'd like to extend greetings and thanks to His Eminence Cardinal Dolan, who has been such a steadfast friend and advocate for the persecuted Christians of the Middle East and elsewhere, to Their Excellencies Bishop Mansour, Bishop Kuka, and of course to Archbishop Warda, under whom I serve in Iraq. To all my fellow presenters here today, your stories have been deeply moving. As well, I'd like to extend thanks to the Anglosphere Society for hosting this event, and of course to our sponsors. Finally, to all of those who are watching with us today in presence and in spirit, thank you and greetings to you all. Before beginning, I'd like to take a brief moment to remember our friend and colleague, Andrew Walther. Andrew died on a Sunday. The Friday before we'd been together on the phone in the morning, he was then back in the hospital. His first concerns that day were not for his own condition, but for our work on behalf of the persecuted religious minorities around the world. It was not until well into the conversation that I stopped him and asked him to set aside the work concerns and tell me how he was that day. He responded that it seemed he now had pneumonia and an intestinal infection, and he did not know, really, where things would go from there. 2 days later, on All Saints' Day, he passed from us. Andrew understood the importance of urgency, and his years of working on behalf of the persecuted had taught him that when it comes to the most marginalized, that governments and large institutions can rarely be left to their own pace. In that lonely gap is the province of the faithful, of those with courage to act and to serve when action and service is needed, no matter the difficulty, no matter the cost. Andrew lived in that place. Having worked side by side with Andrew these past 5 years, I saw the toll that it took on him. His memory and his presence honor us today, and I pray that we remember his sense of faith, courage, and urgency in addressing the matters before us in these dark times. Moving now into our presentation, I'll provide a brief introduction to the work of IATC and how we've become involved in Nigeria. From there, we'll move into a series of short video interviews of victims of Christian persecution and atrocities. These videos have all been taken by our film crews over the past several months and are representative of hundreds which we are compiling now. At IATC, we believe that it's fundamentally important that the voices of the people themselves are heard by those in power, so that their plight is not misrepresented in long-distance reporting, which so often reduces the true dignity and worth of the human being into easily manipulated numbers and theories. After the videos, I'll provide a short summary statement, and from there, we'll turn you over to the program's keynote speaker, His Eminence Cardinal Dolan. The Catholic University in Erbil was founded in 2014 in response to the ISIS genocide, and has since become fully certified in Iraq as both an institution of higher education and a center for research. Out of our experience during the ISIS war, we opened the Institute for Ancient and Threatened Christianity, or IATC, which has recently opened a nonprofit operating entity here in the USA. This opening was made possible through a generous seed funding grant by the Knights of Columbus, which continues on their long and continuing history of supporting the causes of persecuted and threatened Christians throughout the world. Drawing from the unique moral standing of the Christian experience in the Middle East, IATC works to look at the patterns and realities as they affect the people themselves, not relying on governmental and institutional aid reporting, but the voices of the people and the churches directly. Our stated mission is to work in service to preserve both the ancient and the threatened Christian peoples and cultures wherever they are at risk. While not direct providers of humanitarian aid, we work with affected communities to help ensure they receive the support and visibility that they need. As our first area of focus outside the Middle East, IATC began work this past year in Nigeria. There, our ongoing work focuses on the dramatic rise in violence against Christians over the past 3 years. Our work in Nigeria is moving forward in partnership with the Christian Association of Nigeria, or CAN, and the Kuka Center. As you've heard from Bishop Matthew earlier, what's happening now in Nigeria is an incredibly volatile and chaotic situation. The recent massive civil demonstrations have given a new opening, yes, but much remains dangerous and highly uncertain. In our time left today, we'll try to place the current situation of the Christians of Nigeria in context through video testimony from a representative body of Christians from northern Nigeria, all of whom have been victims of religiously involved violence. All of these videos have been taken within the past 2 months, and these Christians are a mix of both Catholics and Protestants. In watching these videos, the following issues become most evident. First, that the violence is comprised of attacks which are religiously based, either in whole or in part. Second, that no governmental or international aid, other than church-based or small private NGOs, is reaching the displaced and the suffering. Likewise, no protection or justice is being provided or even offered to the afflicted Christians. Instead, a recurring theme is that the government is at best doing nothing and is at worst complicit.
On the 18th, 5th, 2020, the Fulani came around 11 a.m. to attack us. We tried to see if we can stop them, but we had no weapons with us, so we ran out of the villages. So they packed our grains, our irrigation pumps, and a lot of things. After then, they burned down our houses, our churches, and even the pastorium. So we ran out from that village to Rumong. The people here are taking care of us, and then other churches, other NGOs, but we've not seen any government official or anything that comes from the government. Churches and individual NGOs have been helping us. And since after the attack, no security presence, no security has been deployed to our village. We couldn't farm this year. We can't go back to our villages. If we try to cross over the river, the Fulani people are still there, they will kill you.
Gaskiya wani abin da ya faru ya shafe ni. Muna zama kawai rigima ya taso kuma wannan rigiman addini ne. Gaskiya ni dai in suna yin bai kai wuri na ba. Tallafin da mun iya samu shine daga ka.
Gaskiya muna zama sai ga Fulani da baburansu sai mun yi gudu mun tafi. Da kyar ma muka tsira, amma wasu ma aka kashe su. Kuma har yau mutane Rimo da mutanen da suna waje su ne suna ciyar da mu. Abinci ma babu. Abin da ya sa na ci addini ne. Mu Kirista mu ne aka zo aka yi mana wannan abin. Kuma ga su Hausawa kusa da mu Hausawa din sun taru dangi da Fulani din sun yi mana wannan abin.
Abin da ya faru ran 16 a watan 5. Fulani sun shiga. Da Fulani na sun shiga, sun ma shiga da safe ne da asuba. Sai waɗansu sun fara cewa mu gudu ga Fulani. Sai muka gudu, sai mazajenmu sun ce mu je cikin gari, sai muka je cikin gari. Sai suka koma kauye din. To sai an juma can sai aka kawo labarin wai Fulani sun fara jefa bindiga. Tunda Fulani sun fara jefa bindiga sai aka kira aka ce wai kara mu dawo wai mu boye. Tunda mun boye to Fulani nan wurin nan ne sun fara kakkashe mutane a wurin. To zan ce wai abin da ya sa suna wani abun saboda sun gan ko mulki nasu ne ko ya ne. To mu a yanzu haka ba dama mu sake. Fulani ma yanda suna ma magana ma sun ce wai sai sun kakkashe mu Christian wai mulki nasu ne. Gaskiya tun da abin ya faru har yau ba mu gan security bare mu ji wai ko gwamnati sun kawo taimako ba. Akwai su coci saka gaskiya suna taimako. Gaskiya sun kone mana kaya sosai musamman kayan kasuwancin mu. Sun kwakwashe da sun kwakwashe sai suka kokone wuri. Sun kashe mai gidana.
Shekarun baya gaskiya an yi kashe-kashe sosai a kasuwar magani. Domin muna cikin kasuwa sai an fara guje-guje. Ka tambaya sai a ce barayi ne, ka tambaya ce shanu ne. A ƙarshen shi sai kawai Hausawa suna bin mu da wukake suna yayyanka mu. Sun zo da yan haya kilas ne sun hada da kansu sun kakkashe Christian a kasuwa. Matsalolin ma har yau muna kan fuskanta. Domin mu rasa dukiyarmu da dama, mu rasa mutanenmu. Wahalallu church ma ba mu iya mu shiga. Ba dama mu fita waje, an sa mana kofi. Ba dama mu je wani wuri. Ba zuwa gona, ba zuwa ko'ina, duk wahalalli duk gashi na har yau wahalan bai kare mana ba. Muna cikin shi. Ba mu ga abin da sun yi ba fa. Mu ga abin da gwamnati sun yi ba. Wallahi mu dai ba mu da abin da za mu yi sai dai mu sa kai mu a cikin addu'a yanda Allah zai kare mu. Kan sun yi mana gudumawa ta wuri baye-baye. Sun kawo mana sutura da kuma abinci. Ni dai na rasa yaro daya a cikin yara yarwa mai gidana an kashe.
Ran 10 ga watan 15 a biyan shi ne class. To sannan da mun ga sakin bai ran 10 ga watan 12 ko bai sakin bai shi ne siye. Sannan mun ga sakin bai ran 4 ga watan 4 na sakin bai shi ne siye. Na mun ga sakin bai ni shirye mai bin biredi na. To gaskiya ko jina ji ukanda jinywe ko biyan tane gwamnati unywe ishe bukata cewa gwamnati ya rite yanka nirbe to si be rishinga nirbe sochi she kwana so jire bitaji konkiwe yanguji ne idejine imyantane mu be sochi ishe roka bene da chari chinga niri parang Kuma já bien ka ji honka sannan abi in ganje honka safe ma ran 10 hudu honka safe to ta ne ji honka nan dana sai da ji da cewa da ne mun to ne irin na wuce ne nan na fara ita ga su birbire ne to ne muru janji ne tanka ko biya kan kashe da yin shi tanka shi ha amra mai ne pete ya meter fiya gamen da wani tanka meter da shi a be ji shi jirgi
Okay. Ta hanji.
Lokacin kuma yana da ciki aka zuwa mamu da attack a cikin gida. Muna kwance da dare wajen 12 dare sai muka ga Fulani suka zo mamu. Sun shiga mamu hari. Kama mu hari a cikin gida sai suka yi kashe-kashe mutum 4 sai ni kuma an harbe ni. A hannu aka cire mun hannu sai nan kuma na ji rauni. Lokaci na da ciki wata 5 sai kuma ga wani abu ya faru ina ta kuka da hawaye ce gwamnati ya yi taimako an ce yana yin taimako ba mu ga taimakon shi ba sai kuma abun da muna addu'a abu ya kare zama haka ya sa hannu ya taimake mu wani abun ya lafa haka gaskiya wanda suna zuwa attack ba da son su ba rashin sani ne da sun san Allah ba abun ba zai faru haka ba muna kuka da hawaye gwamnati ya taimake mu an ce yana taimako ba mu gani ba ya taimake mu ya ji kuka mu ba dama mu fita lokacin sai mu je kota ina mu nima abun da za mu ci da yayan mu yanzu ba dama da za mu fita mu nima abun da za mu ba yayan mu mun shiga daji kuma ni mai tace ko aikin gona sai da ja kore mu har ya yi kashe-kashe kashe wayansu mu addu'a mu Allah ya ji addu'a mu gwamnati ya yi abun da ya kamata a kai mu ya taimake mu
ade atoto obikaji niwe ade ne shireri nwe tare brungwe obikaji here jineto ade ayashwe ibenti juto junwe ade rinsi obire nwe jinwe juwere rishi are rishi atante obikaji niwe ata shireri ji mbere moto ji obikaji niwe ambru an shimbere nka antare nka sose obi mi amata kinefo ateiwe mbe na enyiwe jisra we niama obi ya na nwufo ya amata kihe mbe ngene reshere we niwe nye sranji nye nke ne hari ochune obi ya amata kiwe nke meshi etanyi ne we obi ji ya tantewe gare cho tanteji nke nwushi edire ma eze mbe iri mata kihe fo ateiye jengene igare we jiji chishe jiji bire ya yewe maji nyirimi jiji shere ya yere jimbro were we ni fo mata kizo kure jishe kaji nwa were we je jiji brande ko ji karasanti jibe ni kusu ji roka ni fo ya mata kete mbe jishe kaji nwa were we jishe kaji mbiare bukata ngene de fa mata kiwe ko ji kure we jishe nwewe ji to ji we we anta juto juwe yantane ne juwe ya kanwi jiru yeri geri ha kane ashun to razo ne ran sori geri aje nyiri mi abika ne jiri niwe.
The situation of Christians in the Middle East demonstrated for us patterns that we now see reoccurring in Nigeria and elsewhere in Africa. A toxic blend of religious fanaticism metastasizing against a backdrop of a thoroughly corrupted, complicit, or indifferent government, collapsing economic and educational opportunity, all leading to a rise of religious violence against innocents, in which parallel motivations for unlawful material gain are played out simultaneously. Meanwhile, international analysts and policymakers continue to focus exclusively on the material motivations for the violence, and all too often reach the safely contorted conclusion that what is taking place are mere land and economic disputes, absent of any religiously motivated violence or intent. These conclusions do not bear up under the most basic evidentiary indicators on the ground, the testimony of the victims themselves. As you think about these testimonies that you've heard today, we ask that you please remember the many thousands of people that they represent. In the U.S., it appears now that we are poised on the advent of a new administration, which claims that they will engage in a new direction in many areas of foreign policy. We hope that any new or any present administration will begin their next phase of work by honestly assessing what is taking place in Nigeria and not discounting the voices of the oppressed and persecuted Christians who are trying desperately to tell the world about the truth of what is happening there. In closing, I'd like to thank all of you who participated in this event today for showing up, whether online or in person, and bearing witness with us to the plight of your fellow brothers and sisters around the world. God bless you all. Be safe.
I'm Stephen Enada. I'm co-founder of International Committee on Nigeria, ICON. I'm excited to be here today with fellow discussants, and also I'm very glad to participate in this Anglosphere Society program, Act in Time. The time to act is now, protecting imperiled Christians in ancient and other lands. And today I'm representing that other lands, which is Nigeria. Nigeria in the last 10 years has recorded thousands of deaths as a result of terrorist activities posed by Boko Haram and Fulani militants. We have in our documentation silent slaughter, the ongoing genocide in Nigeria, with other sources to validate this claim that over 62,000 Nigerians have been killed in the last 10 years and over 3 million people have been displaced, and also over 35,000 girls have been sexually trafficked across the Mediterranean. And we have also consistently seen that Nigeria government is unable to address these issues. We even have a boy which we have been rehabilitating. ICON and PSG have taken over the medical bill of Philip, who actually a 4-year-old boy who was attacked by Fulani militants, where he was injured and he was left invalid. So we have to do some kind of, we have to sponsor his reconstructive surgery. He has lost his speech before this time, and after surgery to his hand, to his brain, he's going through some therapy, and that we are praying that Philip will come back to life again. Philip represents thousands of other children who have been maimed, killed as a result of this violent crisis against Christian community in Nigeria. We look at this by engaging Washington policy space from time to time with other civil society organizations to raise this issue of importance that Nigeria is sliding, Nigeria is imploding, and there are these horrendous activities perpetrated by Boko Haram and Fulani militants, and we don't even see anyone being arrested or prosecuted. This is an existential threat. This ongoing atrocity has affected Christian communities in Nigeria. Now we have the case of Kaduna State, where you see many displaced people, and ongoing government playing the ostrich game, not addressing this problem. We can also see as a result of some ethnic clashes in Katsina State, in Zamfara State, in Sokoto State. So Nigeria has these different strands of problems, but the one I'm speaking to today is that of a Christian community in Nigeria. And this is as a result of Boko Haram, who actually have declared Islamic Caliphate or nothing else in Nigeria. go back to 2014, where Chibok girls, who are predominantly Christian girls, who were abducted from their school, who have been sold as sex slaves. And up to now, half of these students have not returned to their parents. And we have Leah Sharibu, who was forced to deny her faith, but she resisted and she's still in captivity. So we have prisoners of conscience as a result of these dubious activities posed by these two dangerous terrorist groups in Nigeria, namely Boko Haram and Fulani militants. With its population of over 200 million, and then you can equally argue that it is evenly divided. The fault lines that you can call, that many people allude to as Christian South and Muslim North. As long as Nigerians are being killed, and also as long as Christian community are being targeted, that all international community, everyone in the international community must respond to this. And today, when we speak about these issues in Nigeria, a lot of people will talk about what we refer to as a moral equivalence story, that, well, it is not only Christians who are being killed. Yes, it is true. But we won't dwell, if government is doing what is right and protecting her citizens, we will not even go to discuss the moral equivalence of this story that Muslims are also being targeted. Yes, they are being targeted because not all Muslims are terrorists. We have law-abiding Muslims in Nigeria who don't want Boko Haram aggression or killings. We are saying Boko Haram actually declared that they want Islamic Caliphate in Nigeria, and that is what promoting the aggression, the ideology, the ideological underpinning that Nigeria must become an Islamic state. We have a humanitarian crisis as a result of this. We have many churches that have been destroyed in Nigeria. EYN, as a denomination in Nigeria, have documented over 500 churches that have been destroyed, burned. Then we have a Catholic seminarian from Kaduna State who was killed. He was abducted and killed. And we have other Christian leaders who actually have been abducted and killed, even when ransom is paid. So this is a situation in Nigeria. We talk about religious freedom, and that is why U.S. Commission for International Religious Freedom, to be precise, designated Nigeria as a country of particular concern. And also the State Department has put Nigeria on the global watch list. With all of these implications, we know that Nigeria, fledgling democracy, is in peril, and also Christian lives in this land has been in peril, and nothing is being done. So we look forward to see how global community, especially Christian community globally, will stand and advocate for these persecuted Christians in Nigeria. The problem is that Nigeria, with over 200 million people, if it implodes, there will be humanitarian crisis across Africa and Europe. So it is a concern, it's an ongoing concern for everybody who cares about this issue in Nigeria, and that is why we are talking about it, and that is why we keep on speaking about it. We have actually had the opportunity to engage US Congress, and this just last September, we have a Congresswoman Tulsi Gabbard, who spoke to this issue, and we have a former Congress person, Frank Wolf, who has consistently spoken against this genocide going on in Nigeria. What has happened in Nigeria, lives that have been lost in Nigeria, is much more than lives that were lost in Iraq and Syria combined. So if genocide is declared in Iraq, it means that genocide has been committed in Nigeria. So we have to come together and we have to make sure we connect with other agencies, government agencies, and also international community to bring this to the fore. We can't hide from this reality. Christians have been targeted in Nigeria, Christians have been killed in Nigeria, and this must stop. Nigeria government must be held accountable, and also perpetrator should be prosecuted. Thank you so much for this opportunity to share with you about what is happening in Nigeria. All what I have said can be located in our website, www.iconhelp.org. You can see the incident tracker, the daily calendar of people who have been killed. In our website, you will find YouTube videos, you will find other information that is necessary for your own information, and to also get acquainted with what is happening in Nigeria. Thank you.
Hello, I bring you hearty greetings from Nigeria, and I want to thank everybody, and thank in particular Stephen for inviting me to this great event that has been undertaken partly in honor of our friend, our brother, Andrew Walter. I'd actually been looking forward to a lot of excitement at the prospects of Andrew and Stephen visiting Nigeria as we had planned and hoped. Sadly, well, I shouldn't say sadly, happily actually, as it turned out, God and his angels had better plans for Andrew, and on the Feast of All Saints, the Lord himself decided to take him to himself, showing very clearly that he had better plans for him than we had in Nigeria. I want to use this medium to extend my hearty sympathies, but also sympathies of joy, because we know that it's only angels. But I want to commend and congratulate and also console the Knights of St. Bartholomew, who he served as a vice president, and I hope and pray that in heaven we will continue to pray for you so that your great work will continue. I want to thank the, in particular, the Americans, Europeans, the various organizations that are working so hard to keep the issue of the persecution of Christians around the world in proper perspective and in focus. In particular, those who have shown tremendous interest in our situation here in Nigeria, aid to Turkey, and many other men and women of goodwill. You've asked me to reflect on the whole question of the situation in Nigeria. You raised the question, is the West ignoring the persecution of Christians? To answer this question, of course, I probably need to take you back history, but I don't think that is important. But I think it's also important to underscore the fact that really right from the beginning of the contact between the British, or should I say the Europeans, and what would finally become the modern Nigerian state, there has been a relationship that is important to understand and to also underscore when we're talking about what is now being presented as the conflict between Christians and Muslims in Nigeria. I was looking at the records the other day and I saw an agreement that was signed between British colonial companies then, even before, a few years before the coming of the British. But in 1885, the British had signed an agreement, with the Fulani kingdoms there, where the Sultan lived. And they signed an agreement with the Sultan, and this agreement was purely and simply an economic it's full of subterfuge and other things. But what was very striking for me was that the British then, to protect their economic interests, made it very clear to the Sultan that they were going to do everything possible to protect the Islamic religion. In 1903, when the British finally conquered the Sultan, Lord Lugard, who was the leader of the expedition, finally became the again still made the point and committed himself to protecting Islam, protecting the religion. And as a result, I'm understanding, if you look around the history of Nigeria, the great work of the missionaries, there was always the colonial obsession with creating almost a cordon sanitaire, to make sure that Islam was being very well protected. And the literature is suffused with conflict, largely bureaucratic, between the colonial state and what would later on become the Nigerian state with the missionaries. And for me, I make the point because that has not changed substantially, despite over 60 years of Nigeria's independence. And then this is really, in many ways, almost what I call the obsession with protecting Islam. It's what has managed to push Christianity, to the periphery. Because in colonial times, the impression was created that Christianity was troublesome. Christian missionaries were creating trouble and disturbing the peace and the serenity of Islam. And since then, as I said, in substance, most of this conversation has not changed. And I say so, and I can speak so, even rather authoritatively, if I may say, because I'm today the Catholic Bishop of the Diocese of Sokoto, which is the heartland, which is really the seat of the Catholic, more or less, the Vatican of the Muslims in Nigeria. So I also come from northern Nigeria, part of what you may call the minority Christian population in northern Nigeria. So I think I understand a little bit of the issues and I know where I'm coming from. I made the point because things have become substantially, we've had all kinds of waves of, in this relationship. And anybody familiar with the literature would appreciate the fact that even before the idea of the persecution of Christians became, hit the public space and became something of international concern, we in Nigeria have actually been living with this over the years. I mean, go back in 1992, for example, when over 100 churches were burnt, between the cities of Zaria and Kaduna. So these are realities that we've lived with. Maybe I should say happily, I thank God for globalization. Now our pains are now being properly recorded across the company, across the world. But if we ask the question, as you try to make me respond to the issue, is the West ignoring the persecution? Of course, the West is ignoring, largely because the reason why the West came to Africa to light up a dark continent. The logic has not changed. This is purely and simply economic expeditions. Those pursuits have become a bit more subtle in the sense that when we're not having trading companies all over the place. But if you look at the Niger Delta in Nigeria, a lot of the crisis that we have in the country, it's about mineral extraction, oil, other resources, and so on. So it's against this backdrop that it's very difficult to single out the issue of the persecution of Christians, because it's often tied to the failure of politics and the failure of the Nigerian state and most African states. But the West is really not very interested, because businessmen are just interested in the most peaceful way to enable the extraction go on unhindered. And so using all kinds of diplomatic subterfuge, we see very clearly that there is literally, beyond just the occasional grandstanding and moral exhortation, there's really no concerted effort by the West to deal with the issues of Christian persecution. In part because Christian persecution is an inconvenient truth. It's not good for business. The result then is that as much as possible, we now find that the reality is now packed in very interesting baggages. So people talk about, well, it is what you have in Nigeria is simply a conflict between farmers and Fulani headsmen. It's a conflict for that is being engineered by climate change. It's a conflict. Everything is being said, but the issue of the persecution of Christians, and priests have been killed. Churchmen and churchwomen have been killed in their churches. Churches have been destroyed across the length and breadth of this country. It's difficult to find. English is not my language, but so I can't find any other word to use except to say that clearly and simply what we are facing is that very clear case of persecution. In terms of the response and what should we be doing, I think speaking about Nigeria, and I see that my good friend and brother, Reverend Nana, is going to be talking to some of the issues. But it's just to say that going forward, the Nigerian situation will be placed in proper context. We're not looking for, Nigeria is not Iraq, our problems are different. Nigeria is not, the Christian situation in Nigeria is not one that should elicit some kind of sympathy, let me put it that way, because our case is different. For the record, what you may call the Christian community in Nigeria actually constitutes 70–80% of the educated, maybe more, of the educated population in Nigeria. And what you call Christians in Nigeria hold about 80%, account for about 80% of the Nigerian economy. So we're not talking about what you may call a vulnerable Christian population that is just looking for support to be protected. No. I think what we're looking for is a much more robust and concerted engagement that addresses the very fundamental issues of the massive human rights violation that continues to go on. Because in very many respects, in many places, such as northern Nigeria, Christians find themselves unprotected. And a lot of the colonial strategies that were put in place have not changed. And because Christianity is seen as capable of causing trouble and the need for us to protect the Muslim community, this is why up to today, even successive governments, criminally, have still refused to allow, what you may call, we're told in the Constitution, it's very clear, yes, there's freedom of religion, there's freedom to practice religion, but my freedom to practice my religion includes the freedom to be able to access a place of worship. The guarantee is protection. But as we're talking today, very, very, most of the 12 core Muslim states in Nigeria, governors then as now are still unwilling, to sign certificates of occupancy and allocate lands for the building of churches. In part because, of course, after years and years of propaganda, it's been the impression that is being presented is that if you allow Christians to build churches, you undermine the religion of Islam. So today, if I'm looking for land to build a church, I have to buy the land, and I have to buy it by other means and go round and round in circles before I'm able to put up a church. So literally everything that Christians have to do, is something that has to be paid for. And yet we're sitting side by side in a situation in which almost 99% of the main mosques that we see across northern Nigeria have been built by state government with state funds. It's taken as given. There's a sense in which almost with Islam, a theocratic underpinning is assumed. But for Christianity, these are some of the very difficult questions. So going forward, I've often said very clearly that look, what the Christian community in Nigeria requires is not, the moral exhortations are okay, the diplomatic pressures are okay, but I think at another fundamental level, we need to start addressing bread and water issues. In Sokoto, in Bauchi, in Katsina, all over the place, in Maiduguri, in Yola, most of our situations in northern Nigeria, in Kafanchan, wherever. If you take a place like Kaduna State, where this whole crisis has been on for a very long time, people are homeless, children are quite a wall of orphans. People need to get back their lives. People have lost means of livelihood. They can no longer, only God alone knows what is going to happen this year because farmers are not able to go to the farm. Those who planted crops have difficulties harvesting the crop. I can tell a personal story, of a nephew of mine who went to work on his farm, 27-year-old young man who was hacked to death. So these are some of the consequences of what we have experienced, and in my view, there needs to be an economic response, to this crisis. And what I mean is that the faith community should now be taken along so that we begin to work towards reconstructing and rebuilding the lives of people. For me, that is perhaps the sure way of guaranteeing the future of Christianity. So while the diplomats walk their talk and talk their talk, I think for us as church, I really think that what we need to do is to encourage the governments, to continue on some of the things that President Trump and a few other people have tried to do, which is to say, look, there is the faith communities need to be engaged, because even in the politics of Africa, most African countries will tell you, if you interview ordinary people on the streets, They are more ready to listen to their bishops and their church leaders than they are to listen to the politicians. So from the point of view of trust, whereas there's a severe trust deficit in the political class, the religious leaders are very much trusted. And then from the point of view of accountability, transparency, and so on, if the church, if the faith communities are taken along, we can almost be sure, one, we are guaranteeing the future of Christianity. Two, also guaranteeing the future of humanity. I mean, where I live in Sokoto, for example, we're struggling to build schools, and of course, because of the limited nature of our population, in many of my schools, I'm having a 60% Muslim presence in the schools. And this, for me, is an investment, to guarantee that the stories of persecution will not be the stories, that we will continue to tell. So finally, I see that Kandadola will be giving the closing remarks. I want to send my greetings to him. I see you've brought in a lot of other distinguished speakers. I really want to thank you. I want to acknowledge Lord David Alton, a great man who has done great things and continues to stand by us in Nigeria. It's actually through him that I got to be involved in a larger part of this conversation. I want to acknowledge and thank him. And I ask God to continue to bless and keep all of you, and I hope you have a very wonderful celebration. May the soul of our brother Andrew and the souls of all the faithful departed through the mercy of God rest in peace. May God console his family. Thank you very much, and keep doing what you're doing. The Lord will be with you. He will bless us. The gates of the underworld will never overturn the Church of Christ. God bless you. Thank you very much.
So our last witness testimony comes from Mariam Ibrahim. And hers is a story that particularly moved me. She's been described by our Holy Father as a living martyr. Her story began in a refugee camp in Sudan. Her mother was an Ethiopian Christian and her father was Muslim. She went to work with the nuns of the Little Sisters of the Poor, but before she moved to Khartoum, her mother died suddenly, and devastated by the loss, she completed her medical degree and became engaged. And only a few months after her first child was born, her world was shattered with a phone call from the police. The police stated that Mariam was considered a Muslim because of her father, and therefore she broke the law by marrying a Christian man, and she must renounce her Christian beliefs and abandon her marriage for the charges to be dropped. After a lengthy trial, she was charged with apostasy, adultery, and imprisoned with her 9-month-old son, Martin, and actually she was condemned to be executed. But when she was in prison, it was found out that she was pregnant, and according to Islamic law, you cannot execute a pregnant woman, and she was given a 2-year reprieve. And she ended up giving birth to her baby in a prison cell, manacled on the floor. And her fate, though, to attract the attention of the world and the Italian government, and a rescue mission was organized, and she came to the United States in the fall of 2015. She met the Holy Father, and she resettled in the United States, where she started a foundation for women who've been trafficked, and she's now witnessing to her faith to us today. Thank you.
Good afternoon. My name is Mariam Ibrahim. I'm a religious persecution survivor from Sudan. In 2014, the Muslim judge in Sudan sentenced me to death by hanging and receive 100 lashes. My crimes was apostasy and adultery. And the reason I was charged by those because I was born for a Muslim father and a Christian mother. And I was considered by the law an adulterer and apostasy for committing apostasy and adultery by marrying a Christian man and growing up as a Christian, practicing my Christian faith, following my mother. So, and after my sentence, my children also was sentenced to be sent to the orphan. I have 1-year-old boy who spent the whole time with me in prison, and I gave birth to my second child, my daughter, in prison while my legs in shackles. But they are in the eyes of the law are adulterial children, and I have no right to raise them. After my execution, they're going to be sent to the orphan, so their father have no right to raise them as well. The prison is very harsh condition. Prison. There's too many children other than my son, and too many broken-hearted women, hopeless mothers, and their children for different crime. And in most cases is related to prosecution. Like some women make a local wine, it's considered a crime under Sharia law, and all. Even till now, with all this change happening in my country, so I faced too many challenges inside the prison, and it's before my case been known for take a public opinion. I have acquired the same. I mean, I face the same challenge as other inmates in prison, but after my case get international attention and all this things get very hard for me from part of my relationship with other inmates. They know me as a Christian, and she convert, and she I wasn't convert, but I considered convert by the law by refusing to accept Islam. So I would face too many threats inside the prison with other inmates, and then is extra guards around me and my son. Like when I have my visit with my attorney, I would have like 10 guards sitting on the room, and the visit only for 10 to 15 minutes. The same thing with my husband. My visit only 10 to 15 minutes, and I'm not allowed to talk certain things or to share anything. Like I just talk. I don't even discuss my case. My lawyer even are not allowed to tell me what to say or what to do, because all the pressure on me to say a shahada or to accept Islam so I can get released. And for them, and when I refuse to say that, this is the biggest problem, and they put too much pressure on me. Like, but my heart always in peace, no matter what the guards or the judge or the other inmates said. The night I actually got this, the night I was sent to prison, it was Christmas Eve in 2013. So the judge decided to send me that night. I said, okay. And then when I went there, like I didn't realize it's going to end up like that. I know they are serious, and I feel like they are serious about my sentence. And everybody, even some of the attorneys and other guards and other prison and the police officer will tell me there's too many women in your situation came in here. And it's the same. You have to just say, accept Islam and just walk out free, receive 100 lashes, and just go do whatever you want to do. For me, I just couldn't do that. And I had a feeling like that something will happen. Like, I know that's what you are saying, but God have my life or the death on life, it's in God's hand, it's not in the judge's hand. Even if I can say, yes, I am a Muslim, and I walk out of the prison, walk out of the courtroom, get hit by a car, I can die that moment. It's not a matter of death or life, but it's the thing that our relationship with God, the commitment that we made when I stood on the altar and accept Jesus Christ as my Savior. So that's always something that I have to remind myself about, no matter what the judge said, no matter what the God said. And for my children also, I have to think like, what I'm going to tell them, tell them when you are a Christian, you know God's command in your life, when you know how to, you accept God and Jesus, as a savior in your life. So you can, no matter what's happened, you can change that, no matter what it is what's happening. Besides, we got the scriptures. I actually have to live through all the scriptures, different stories in the Bible, what's happened. Jonah, he was 3 days on where I was given 3 days. So God will work this. Something will happen, and I will come out of this. I will survive this, and I know something will happen like that. And even if I have to die, I would die with honor, like knowing that I didn't deny Christ, because that's way is the life and death. I can live life without Christ, but it have no meaning for me as a Christian. And then that. The other thing, even after I have to flee Sudan, with all this thing, I don't have any idea about what's happening outside the world, because I'm not even allowed to have a piece of paper or pen. After my go to court and come back before the sentence, they search all over my body. My son's diaper, like everything I carry. And they search all on the hair. And some of the elements will hide like SIM card, like memory card, things like that. And they find it, and then you get in trouble with the prison guard. You get 3 days on a cell just by yourself. I have this miraculous medal. I was given to this by Father John, my priest, when I get my confirmation at the Catholic Church in 2005. He gave me this miraculous medal, and I hid it on my hair. And I feel, even when during the guard was searching, I feel she touched it, but she never find it. This is my Bible, the one I have in prison also. It went in by, I have to bribe some of the guards, and then I have to give it to one of the Muslim inmates. She's from Ethiopia, one of the refugees. It's have this water because we used to put it in a plastic bag, and it's on the ground. We dig on the ground, and she have to go out in the middle of the night, and she dig out and bring it to me. And then she have to sit around, because they have to be aware if somebody comes, some of the guards came. This is before my sentence. This is before my case gets the attention. So I have too many stories and too many things to share, but the time is not enough. So I was released. I was called into the office, and then I was given some paper to sign, and I don't know even what it was. So I was released from prison, and then I have to seek refugees at the U.S. Embassy for 1 month. And then the Vatican have to step in, and miraculously they negotiate with the Sudanese government on my behalf, and I was given a chance to travel to leave Sudan. I flew to my country on July 24, 2014 to Italy. I spent 10 days in Italy, and I came to United States in August of 2014.
And who negotiated your release?
The situation, the relationship between Sudan and U.S. at that time is very bad, and then Sudan tried to use that to get off the terrorist list, use my case, because there's too much pressure from the United States over Sudan and all. Even during my labor giving birth to Maya, the prison guard will kick me by the boot, which I still struggle with this back pain. And she was telling me Sudan is being characterized by the world opinion because of your case. And I don't know what she's even talking about. And my daughter was born, and like this is the Bible, when God wanted to bring something new, a child was born, like Moses, like Jesus. So Maya's birth is giving me a second chance, and she's the reason God's given me new life. And Pope Francis called her miraculous child, and that's true. So the other challenge they have to face, how to tell my children these stories. And then we show the picture for Martin when he's a baby. He was born in a hospital and everything. So Maya start questioning, Mama, how about me when I was born? So, and my heart is so heavy how to tell him that. and how to tell them in a way that they don't hate somebody else.
Right.
And they don't hold gratitude against any religion or anything. So I have to tell them too many stories, like a story of Paul.
What a story. An amazing witness to faith. And I'm very honoured now to have His Eminence Cardinal Dolan, who is the newly elected chairman of the Religious Liberty Committee at the USCCB, I think, our bishop's right. And he may be newly elected to that role, but he's been an inspiration to this effort for the last 5 years. In my life, much longer in other people's lives. But I'm deeply grateful to have him with us now, and he's going to speak to us about witnessing to faith. And we welcome him and are delighted to have him.
Thank you, Amanda. I appreciate you and David, and I'm really grateful for this annual event that I think we've all come to look forward to. It's not that, I'm preaching to the choir now. I don't have to tell you anything that you don't already know and have heard more eloquently today. But what a source of inspiration and solidarity we could encourage one another at least once a year to come together like this. So thank you, Amanda. And I always appreciate this evening. This is the only event that I go to where they have pictures of chilled martinis on the table. This is superb. I feel at home because I look around and see so many friends. Archbishop Concha, I'm sure glad to see you. Thank you. You've only been here for 10 months, but you sure made your presence felt, and we're glad you're here. Monsignor Bakari, Bishop Mansour, Patrick, thank you. You're still basking in the joy of the beatification of Blessed Father Michael McGivney, as all of us are. Catherine Jean Lopez, thank you. I just see so many friends, and I'm just grateful. I'm just grateful to be here, folks. Thanks. I'm only going to speak for 10 minutes or so, but it comes from the heart. A number of years ago, I had the honor of celebrating the Mass of dedication for the Cathedral of the Resurrection in Kiev. And a particularly moving moment came when Metropolitan Shevchuk asked the Lord's protective hand upon believers suffering persecution for their faith anywhere in the world. And it moved me very much that such a heartfelt plea came from a people who had themselves been oppressed for so long in Ukraine. It just made it all the more poignant. An enlightening event such as this, my brothers and sisters, encourages us to think Catholic. And I use the word Catholic with a small c, to think universally, to think worldwide, about our brothers and sisters in the faith, now suffering grievously simply because they sign themselves with the cross, they bow their heads in the holy name of Jesus, they happily profess the Apostles' Creed every Sunday. We bishops in the United States have, as you well know, legitimate and ongoing struggles to protect our first and most cherished freedom. But even our problems, as towering as they can be at times and as ominous as as the future might now seem, they pale in comparison, don't they, to the Via Crucis that's currently being walked by so many of our Christian brothers and sisters in other parts of the world who are experiencing lethal persecution. Don't you agree that if our common membership in the mystical body of Christ is to mean anything, then their suffering must become ours as well? We're living in what must be recognized as, in the words of Pope St. John Paul II, a new age of martyrs. As you know, the chilling statistic, one expert calculates that half of all Christian martyrs in the 2 millennia history of the Church were killed in the 20th century Rome. And this 21st century, I'm scared, doesn't seem to promise much better. This century, only 2 decades old, has already seen 1.25 million people killed around the world simply because of their belief in Jesus Christ. And that threat to religious believers is growing.
You're familiar with the compelling research of the Pew Research Center that reports that 75% of the world's population lives in countries where governments, social groups, or individuals restrict people's ability to freely practice their faith. Now, you and I don't need those statistics because we know them. We see them on the news every day. A couple examples of what's going on. Zanzibar, Muslims and Christians have long lived peacefully side by side, but there's increasing violence. Catholic churches have been burned, priests have been shot. One priest was the victim of a horrid acid attack recently. Nigeria, thank you, Amanda, for highlighting Nigeria. When Amanda and I kibutzed a number of months ago about the makeup of the day, I said, let's make sure we get something from Nigeria, because as you saw, I am very, very aware from my brother bishops, especially Archbishop Ignatius Kaigama, who's a good friend of mine, that things in Nigeria are getting bad. India has been so brave, particularly after the Orissa massacre. We remember with a lot of apprehension our brothers and sisters in China, where Catholic bishops and other religious leaders are subject to state harassment and imprisonment. I'm afraid conditions seem to be getting worse as the government closes churches and subjects members of several faiths to forced renunciation in so-called re-education camps. We admit as well that it's not just Christians who suffer from religious persecution, but believers of other faiths as well. We hear that a lot of religious persecution is committed by Muslims against other Muslims. Buddhists in Tibet suffer under government torture and repression. In Myanmar, we have seminarians at St. Joseph's Seminary here in Dunwoody, here in the Archdiocese from there. Muslims are suffering at the hands of Buddhist mobs, and all of us share in a rising apprehension over reports of growing anti-Semitism in Europe. But there's no escaping the fact that Christians are singled out in far more places and a lot more often. And I don't have to tell you that our brothers and sisters in the Middle East face particular crisis. Patriarch Bartholomew of Constantinople has observed that for Christians in the Middle East, even the simple admission of Christian identity places the very existence of the faithful in daily threat. The humanitarian catastrophe that continues to unfold in Syria has been particularly close to our hearts, as we can validly consider Syria as part of the Holy Land. Their venerable history makes their suffering particularly poignant. And just as Syrian Christians have suffered from the war raging in their land, why the war in Iraq has devastated that ancient Christian community in Iraq. We stay close to the bishop. Was he with us earlier via live stream? Yes, he tearfully tells me, he used to be able to come a couple of times a year, he can't anymore, that the situation of Christians there has become a tragedy of immense proportions, with many religious and lay faithful tortured and killed. The situation in Syria and Iraq wrench our hearts, but we can't forget the plight of the Christians in Egypt. Thanks be to God, things seem to be improving, but our sources there tell us that the situation is still very worrisome and brittle. I'm wearing the cross that the Coptic Patriarch, the Coptic Archbishop here out on Staten Island, to whom I've gotten close, has given me as a sign of our unity with those Christians in Egypt. Look, we're members of one of the most richly blessed communities of faith on the planet, everybody. And we have been believers who have spoken with enthusiastic unity in defense of our own religious freedom here in the United States. But it can't stop there. What we've received as a gift, as St. Paul says, we give as a gift. So we got to become advocates and champions for these Christians who have been brought to our attention again on this powerful day. We need the enthusiastic backing of our people, not just our leaders like those gathered in the room today. And if we don't have that, we're not going to get too far. Pope Francis recently reminded us, or invited us to an examination of conscience in this regard. Remember what he said? When I hear that so many Christians in the world are suffering, am I indifferent? Or is it, as a member of my own, is it more than a member of my own family is suffering? When I think or hear it said that many Christians are persecuted and give their lives for their faith, does this move my heart? Am I open to that brother or sister in my family who's giving his or her life for Jesus Christ every day? Do we pray for one another? Do we pray for persecuted Christians? Everyone responds in his or her own heart. It's important to look beyond one's own fence. We all leave a powerful day like this asking, what can we do? And without presuming being exhaustive, here are a couple ideas I'd like to share with you. First, and we as believers can never underestimate this, we encourage constantly intercession for the persecuted. Some of you old-timers, and I might be the oldest member in the room, remember how the prayers for the conversion of Russia about 60 years ago we had at the end of Mass every day. And it shaped my sense as a child about what was going on behind the Iron Curtain. And a similar culture of prayer for persecuted Christians today, both in private and in our liturgical celebrations, could have a similar remedial effect. I'm so happy when I do my parish visitations to see that automatically prayers for persecuted Christians seem to be a hallmark of our prayers of the faithful. We also want to make people aware of the great suffering of our brothers and sisters with all the means at our disposal. You all in this room are responsible for columns, blogs, letters, speeches, bulletin announcements, technological resources. I've asked my pastors to preach on this, to spice their sermons with examples of today's martyrs, and to really consider study sessions on the plight of persecuted Christians as part of every parish's ongoing faith formation. We encourage our Catholic media to tell the stories of today's new martyrs, and unfortunately abundant people like Catherine Jean do that eloquently. Our good experience here in the United States defending religious freedom shows that when we turn our minds to an issue, we can put it on the map. And it's time to harness that energy to our fellow members of the household of the faith who are hounded for their beliefs around the world. Can I use this occasion to thank many of the groups represented in this room right now for doing just that? I'm thinking of sterling organizations such as Aid to the Church in Need, the Catholic Near East Welfare Association. Thank you, Monsignor Vicari, for being here. Catholic Relief Services, the Society for the Propagation of the Faith in Defense of Christians. Thank you, Bishop Mansour, for your leadership there. The Knights of Malta, the Knights of the Holy Sepulchre. Thank you, Vicki. And who's done such a powerful job under the leadership of Carl Anderson, the Supreme Knight, our beloved Knights of Columbus. Thank you for being here with us today, Patrick. They've all done heroic work. Among our Protestant brothers and sisters, you're familiar with groups such as Open Doors, writers such as Nina Shea and Paul Marshall, John Allen, Philip Jenkins, Catherine Jean Lopez. They help keep these issues alive. And I can't fail to mention, and I know you've dedicated this day to him, the great work of Andrew Walter, whose mourning we still pass. And to you, dear Amanda, for your splendid efforts with the Anglosphere Society. And finally, especially here in New York, and those of you who have come up from Washington, we can insist that our country's leaders make the protection of at-risk Christians abroad a foreign policy priority for the United States. We can also cajole political leaders to be more attentive to the voices of Christians on the ground, since those Christians will certainly feel the consequences of whatever we do or don't do. You remember Dr. Thomas Farr, a professor at the Georgetown School of Foreign Service. He reminded us bishops a couple of years ago that the protection of religious freedom abroad and the advocacy of oppressed believers, sadly, has hardly been a high foreign policy priority for administrations of either party. And in that regard, I'm going to say something that could get me in a little trouble. I'm far from an expert, but in my years as a bishop, when I've been involved in this issue, I have not found an administration more attentive to the needs of persecuted Christians in the world than the current administration. There have been occasions when my brother bishops have asked me to intercede with President Trump, and I try and I do, and he has come through. As Bishop Mansour can back me up, a solicitude from the Church in Lebanon, as Archbishop Boris Kutsiak of the Ukraine Catholic Church can back me up, an attentiveness to the suffering in Ukraine, and as my brother bishops in India can back me up, an attention to the persecution in India, have all become part of this administration's outreach when it's been brought to their attention. And I want to give a special nod to the Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo, who has been particularly attentive and sensitive to the needs of suffering Christians, aided by his wife Susan, who they're both committed Christians. And she has a particular solicitude for the Eastern Rite, Orthodox and Catholic. Protecting religious freedom will certainly be a central social and political concern of our time. We know that. But right now, and I love the theme of the day, right now we're being beckoned by history, by Pope Francis, by one another, by the force of our own logic, and the ecclesiology of communion preached so well by the Holy Father, to extend those efforts to the dramatic front lines of the battle, where Christians are paying for their fidelity with their very lives. We here in New York have a particular box seat on this because so many Christians from these suffering lands end up here, and we come in contact with them, and they do not fail to advocate on behalf of their Christians in the homeland. Archbishop Kacha knows that very often when we hear of an atrocity, the Holy See and our conference and myself, I don't shy away from confronting, either by a visit or a phone call, the representatives to the United Nations or the consul generals of those nations. I don't hesitate to let them know of our deep concern and our desire to have assurances that such things are going to be ameliorated. I mentioned the Coptics that I'm wearing the cross that Bishop David gave me, and he also gave me an icon that I cherish very much. I used to be a teacher, I still am, I guess. You always bring an audio visual in. Bishop David gave me this icon, everybody. You may be familiar with it. It's the martyrs of Libya. You remember the story, what was it, about 4 or 5 years ago now, that these poor Coptic Christians were rounded up and arrested simply because they were Christians. They had left Egypt and were working in Libya to support their families, and they were arrested in Libya. They were imprisoned and tortured for a while, and finally they were brought to the seashore, where each of them was given a question. If you renounce your faith, if you renounce your Christianity, you can live. And of course, none of them did. They said to them, what is your religion? And if they said Islam, they were freed. If they said Christianity, they were beheaded. And all of them were. One of them was not a Christian. You see Martin there? You come up and look at it close afterwards. You'll see there's one deep black person there, and he's Martin. When they came to him, they said, what religion are you? And you probably heard the story. Martin said to them, I don't know. I don't think I have one. He didn't know what religion he was. But he beckoned to those around him and he said, but whatever religion they got, that's the one I want. And I belong to that. He was beheaded. He was so moved by the compassion and the concern and the prayer and the faith and the trust of these Christians with whom he had been imprisoned for months, captured and imprisoned. He was so moved that he professed their faith. And legitimately, do we call him a martyr with baptism of blood? My brothers and sisters, we're asked to do the same. We are so moved by the example of our martyrs that we say, that's our religion too. And we need to rise up in their defense. And Amanda, once again, I thank you for allowing us to come together and encourage one another. And I thank every one of you for being here today and the good work that you do. I'm glad that Monsignor Joe Lamarck from the Archdiocese, our Vicar General, is here, Bettina Alonso, who is our Director of Development, been involved in so many other causes. Monsignor Vicari, thank you for being here with CANEWA, the Catholic Near East Welfare Association. You do know that today is the anniversary of the death of Monsignor John Nolan, who was a great executive secretary of that organization for so long. And the Knights of Columbus, the good stuff all of you do. You encourage me. And I say, whatever religion you belong to, count me in. Thank you.
The program now is ended, except we do have from Michael, from the head of the EWTN, Michael Warsall, a very short tribute to our Andrew.
Thank you so very much for this opportunity to share a few words of reflection about Andrew Walther. I had the blessing of having known Andrew for nearly 15 years, and of counting him as one of my closest friends. I also had the added blessing of being able to collaborate with Andrew on a daily basis since June of this year, when he joined EWTN as President and Chief Operating Officer of our news division. Although he was diagnosed with leukemia just a few weeks after he joined us at EWTN, he never slowed down, nor ever wavered in his tireless commitment to our global mission, even up to the hours just before his death. When Andrew and I began to discuss his coming to EWTN News, one of the first topics of conversation was about the ways in which he would be able to continue to improve and expand upon the work EWTN had been doing in telling the stories of persecuted Christians around the world. He was excited to have the ability to bring his knowledge and relationships to his new role at EWTN in a way that would continue his life's most important work of caring for and protecting persecuted Christians. From the many messages of condolence that poured in following his passing, the impact of Andrew's work in this area was immense. One of the best ways for all of us to honor Andrew's memory is to recommit ourselves to the cause of persecuted Christians. Andrew's passing is indeed a great loss for all of us at EWTN and for the Church. But it's an exceptionally difficult loss for his wife Maureen and their 4 very young children, who brought him such great joy. I hope you'll join me in praying for the repose of Andrew's soul and for the consolation of all who mourn his passing. Eternal rest grant unto him, O Lord, and let perpetual light shine upon him. May his soul and the souls of all the faithful departed, through the mercy of God, rest in peace. Amen.